Good morning, everyone. I'm very grateful that you're here. I'm sorry that we're starting a few minutes late. Cindy, thank you very much for taking care of all of this, and your colleagues as well from the Agriculture Committee. But we got both Wi-Fi back and the air conditioning, so we appreciate it very much. And I am pleased to have the chance to call this subcommittee hearing on conservation, climate, forestry, and natural resources to order, and especially to welcome all of you to Burlington, Colorado. I am extremely grateful to my colleague, Ranking Member Roger Marshall, for his partnership in convening today's field hearing, and I'd like to thank his staff, Tucker, and my staff, Rosie, for their excellent collaboration in getting us here this morning. I know Senator Marshall shares my concern about the unprecedented drought that farmers and ranchers throughout the western United States are enduring. And he's been an outstanding bipartisan partner in the work that we've been doing on the Agriculture Committee. I want to thank the Agriculture Committee staff who have traveled here to ensure that our hearing on the High Plains runs just as smoothly, maybe even more so than it would in a hearing room in Washington. In fairness to all of us, we don't have some of the cast of characters that we have in Washington, D.C. To screw things up today. I also want to thank all of the Colorado State University staff for their support, our hometown charitable foundation for hosting us at the historic Midway Theater, the city of Burlington for welcoming our attendees from near and far, and all of our witnesses today. Well, I'm glad to live in a country where people can speak freely, and it's one of the great things about being in the United States. I also should say, I didn't say at the beginning how nervous I am about interrupting wheat harvest today, and I think Senator Marshall joins me in saying if you need to leave, you need to leave, and please don't worry about it. But we look forward to the witnesses' testimony today. Many hands go into making a successful field hearing happen, and I'm grateful to all of you. Our purpose today is simple and straightforward. It's to hear directly from Western producers who are facing unprecedented challenges of a hotter, drier landscape and using innovative tools to combat historic drought. There is no more appropriate place to talk about this issue than Burlington. During the Dust Bowl, devastating dust storms plagued farmers here in Kit Carson County. Black dust blanketed roads, suffocated livestock, destroyed crops, and ruined the livelihoods of thousands of eastern Coloradans and western Kansans who took generations to recover. I was grateful to spend yesterday in Kansas, yesterday afternoon, visiting with a farmer there and his family who are wrestling with the effects of drought. That was a terrible time for American agriculture, and out of desperation, farmers and ranchers put subpar land into production. They were told that rain would follow the plow as they struggled to feed their families. This made America's working lands vulnerable to dust storms that ravaged our heartland. Prairie winds blew 50 million tons of topsoil off the southern plains in 1935 alone. And after that, some of that dirt, land, and dust landed on the U.S. Capitol. Congress finally recognized the crisis on the eastern plains by creating the Soil Conservation Service, which has since become the Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS. For almost 90 years, NRCS has partnered with farmers and ranchers and private landowners to protect our farms and safeguard our natural resources. The Farm Service Agency also plays a critical role mitigating the effects of drought and managing agricultural land, from the Conservation Reserve Program to crop and livestock disaster programs that are so important to our producers. Today, their mission have never been more important as we confront a changing climate and a hotter, drier future. But these programs haven't kept pace with the West that looks very different from the Dust Bowl era. I hear from producers across the state that NRCS and FSA programs need to be much more flexible and allow for more innovation, but instead are burdened by red tape. The applications are cumbersome, as we heard yesterday, only accepted during short enrollment windows, and USDA takes too long to process them. In some cases, people have to literally fill out their applications by hand and send them in by mail in 2024. Many of you likely knew Pat O'Toole, the cattle and sheep rancher whose family's sixth-generation operation straddles the Colorado-Wyoming border. He and his wife Sharon managed their ranch with future generations in mind.
Senator Bennet, if this is a climate crisis, we need to end the causes, not fund them. Animal ag is causing the climate crisis. It cannot solve it. No more money for planet killers. No more money for animal killers. Plant-based food system now. Plant-based food system now.
Pat O'Toole is not an animal killer or a planet killer. He and his wife Sharon managed the ranch with future generations in mind every single day. And before Pat's recent passing, he was in the middle of preserving the family's ranch through a USDA agricultural conservation easement. That easement had been in the back and forth process with NRCS since November 2020, and Pat sadly was unable to see his family's ranch protected before his passing in February this year. Federal red tape is especially tough on young farmers, small-scale producers, underserved, and first-generation farmers. They don't have the time, nobody does, to navigate the bureaucracy and can't afford to hire someone to do it for them. The future of rural America depends on whether the next generation decides to continue operating their family farms and ranches. Today, we're going to hear from experts, producers, and partners who, like Senator Marshall and I, are concerned for the future of rural America. They will highlight their experience with drought and a rapidly changing landscape. They will tell us about the federal programs that work well, and they will tell us about the programs that are not working for farmers and ranchers, especially those west of the Mississippi River. We'll also hear from producers who are breaking tradition with how their grandparents or parents once farmed and pioneering practices to grow food and fiber for the rest of us. To underscore the issues of drought affecting American agriculture, I have a map of the current U.S. drought monitor and testimony from the National Association of Wheat Growers, the Colorado Wheat Growers Association, the American Rivers, that's describing the situation we face. I ask unanimous consent that they be entered into the record. So moved. That's the good thing about being chairman of a subcommittee. When I do that in D.C., I have to get the attention of the chair. Instead of a dust bowl, today's farmers and ranchers are dealing with a 1,200-year drought. They face a changing climate and a future that's going to get hotter and drier. And as we meet today, more than half the country is in the throes of a historic heat wave, while wildfires raging across the West. We don't have time to waste. This is a 5-alarm fire, and Washington needs to treat it that way. My hope is that today's hearing can help us identify specific ways to make progress, and I'm prepared to work with every member of the Agriculture Committee in a bipartisan way to do so. So now let me stop there, and I will turn it over again to the ranking member, Senator Marshall from Kansas, who is good to make the trip over here. As we talked about yesterday, the border between Colorado and Kansas doesn't really recognize distinctions in drought or in the challenges that our producers are facing. So I can't think of a more appropriate person to be here to have this conversation with than Senator Roger Marshall. Please give him a round of applause for making the trip.
Thanks. Well, Senator Bennet, it's a great honor to be up here with you. I appreciate your hospitality. I want.
Agriculture is one of the leading causes of climate change.
Well, like I was saying, Senator Bennet, it's an honor to be here with you. I want to thank you, Rosie, you and your staff. I know that the staff really does all the work as well, so thank you. And you recent marriage, is that right? Yeah. So recent. So she's on her honeymoon here.
This is her honeymoon.
This is her honeymoon. Welcome to our witnesses. Thanks to my staff. Tucker Stewart's behind me, our ag person, and Katie Sawyer's out there as our state director. Thanks for making this all possible. On a personal basis, Senator Bennet, it's an honor to just not call you a colleague, but a friend. And to tell a story on both of us, we work out together about every afternoon when we're back in D.C. And it's an interesting place the Senate gym is. Before you get your eyes off in too much of a mindset what this looks like. This is worse than any YMCA I've ever been in. It is, but I love it. I love the gym. We let our guards down, and I can attest that there's probably nobody in better aerobic shape than Senator Michael Bennet. I mean, he works at it hard on this biking business. So I appreciate that about him as well. And I would just assure people in the audience and the folks that are watching from home is that there's no one more committed to leaving this world cleaner, healthier, and safer than we found it than the two of us. And it's in our heart, it's in our soul. This is a priority. And as we think about future generations, why we're in the Senate, came to Congress, this would be one of my 3 things that I'd like to leave a mark on before we leave. So very, very important to me. And you're right about the similarities between the state, that in so many ways, eastern Colorado looks like western Kansas, and it's no surprise that once upon a time we're sitting in Kansas territory. Just want to remind everybody of that this was Kansas territory once upon a time. But we do share much more than a border. We share this drought. For about 10 of the last 15 years, we've shared this drought. Many parts of my state, your state, are a year's worth of moisture behind. In the last 5 years, we've lost a year's worth of moisture. And we continue to struggle. And that I believe that water will be the defining issue of our states for not just the near future, but for generations ahead, and not just for agriculture, but for municipalities as well. This is the defining issue: water conservation. It is the most valuable commodity that our nation is blessed with. And I think for the folks that are listening back in D.C., it's so important to understand what this aquifer is and how important it is to American agriculture as we continue to feed and clothe the world. That this aquifer is like an ocean beneath us. That if you would go down about 400 to 500 feet beneath the ground where we're sitting today, there is an ocean of fresh water. And it goes from South Dakota through Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming. In some places it's 100 foot deep, some places it's 1,000 foot deep. And the rate of going down is faster than we've replenished it, but we've slowed down that replenishment thanks to conservation practices. And we visited a farm yesterday where they basically are at net neutral now. By conservation practices alone, they are now at a neutral use of that water. And I think that's what we're here to accentuate today. As you mentioned, 90 years ago, the Dust Bowl ravaged our corner of the world. And my great-great-great-grandparents were starting family farms across the state of Kansas and building terraces, trying to figure out how to conserve this land. We've had some spring rains that have provided some moisture, but we still have this drought going on, and we're not close to being out of the woods. We don't know what the summer holds. We don't know what the fall holds. We don't know what next year holds. Providing a valuable perspective on this area, some of Kansas's and Colorado's brightest minds, who I'm excited to have here today and to listen and learn. There's been a great public-private partnership between agriculture producers and the federal government, and we've created the strongest food system in the world. We're so blessed. Food security is national security. We're so blessed that we're not dependent upon other countries to feed us, but many countries are dependent upon us to help feed them. In Washington, D.C., many lawmakers and agency staff may be unfamiliar with the type of challenges our farmers and ranchers face on these high plains. In fact, Kansas and Colorado only qualified for about 40% of the conservation practices through the IRA. Let me say that again. Kansas and Colorado ranchers and farm producers only qualified for about 40% of the conservation through the IRA. We need some more flexibility, if at all possibility. Our farmers and ranchers want to do the right thing, but we need some flexibility. These environmental practices were designed to cut carbon emissions, yet they cut out some of our country's highest crop-producing region and our nation's second largest carbon sink, soil. We don't have the wonderful forest that Colorado has for a carbon sink, but the soil carbon sinks that we have in our states are just as important. And I'll give you an example of some of the environmental practices that we simply can't do in eastern Colorado or western Kansas. Anyone that farms east of the 100th meridian are getting paid by the federal government to grow cover crops, but the practice doesn't work out here. We simply don't have the moisture to do it. We would love to do cover crops, but we don't have the moisture, and that's why we need the flexibility. We've seen natural disasters, drought, and wildfire. Farmers and ranchers need federal assistance to maintain their livelihoods and continue producing our nation's food supply. Unfortunately, the bureaucracy sometimes in D.C. delayed the process, and we owe it to our producers to set up and improve and implement safety net mechanisms. Senator Bennet, since I was a little kid, raised on a farm, riding on a tractor, my grandparents spent time teaching me how important it was to leave our farm better for the next generation. And that's why I've said our farmers and ranchers were the original conservationists, and today we'll explore the best ways to support them amidst prolonged drought as the federal government, whether it's through improving conservation flexibilities, developing research opportunities, or strengthening disaster relief funding. I'm confident that we'll come out of today's field hearings with innovative solutions for farmers and ranchers in our corner of the country and beyond. I think about this, that we are the descendants of those people that homesteaded out here, that they figured out ways to innovate and persevere, and through hard work, pass it on to future generations. So I'm confident we can do it. And again, I'm just so honored to be here to help you and empower us to help solve this problem. Thank you. So I have two witnesses I want to introduce today. And I think we'll introduce them all, and then they'll give their testimonies later. So I'm going to first introduce Chip Redmond. So Chip, thank you for being here today. He was originally from Ohio, but we're now proud to call Chip a Kansan. He obtained a bachelor's degree from The Ohio University with minors in computer science and physics in 2011, and a master's from South Dakota School of Mines and Technology. For the last year, he's been the Kansas Mesonet manager in the Department of Agronomy for the Fighting Ever Fighting Kansas State Wildcats. He works extensively with the Mesonet, a network of 80-plus weather stations in the state. He's also an incident meteorologist for Rocky Mountain Area, complex incident management team in the Kansas Forest Service. And finally, he's a volunteer and one of my favorite loves. He's captain of the Blue Township Fire Department and assists in coaching his children's baseball, softball teams. He resides in one of the most beautiful cities in Kansas, St. George, Kansas, along the Blue River there, the Blue Kansas River there. And then also I'm going to introduce Connie Owen. Connie is the director of Kansas Water Office, and prior to that, she served as the chair of the Kansas Water Authority. She's a licensed attorney and has practiced Kansas water law for over 25 years. In 2004, she served as the administrative hearing officer, presiding over the initial hearings for the first two, something I'm very proud of, the local enhanced management areas, which we refer to as LEMAs in Kansas. These programs help with water conservation in Kansas. She's a lifelong Kansan. She earned her bachelor's degree from the Emporia State University, the Fighting Hornets, and has her law degree from the University of Kansas. Connie and her husband Dan live in Overland Park and have two grown sons. Glad to have both of you here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roger. I'd like to introduce first Mr. Robert Sakata, who's an agricultural policy advisor for the Colorado Department of Agriculture and serves as president of Sakata Farms in Brighton, Colorado. Robert was born and raised in Colorado and grew up on his family farm. which his father started in 1944. Over time, his family farm successfully adapted to production pressures, including the decreasing availability of water, lack of adequate seasonal labor, housing, which we've talked about a lot, increasing costs of crop inputs, and urban encroachment. In addition to his lifelong farming experience, Robert has served in a wide range of agricultural and water-focused positions beyond his farm, including the Colorado Department of National Resources, Interbasin Compact Committee, and the Colorado Water Conservation Board. I'm grateful to have him with us at this hearing today. Robert, I look forward to your testimony. Mr. Peter Goebel is next, a climatologist for the Colorado Climate Center at Colorado State University. His responsibilities include supporting the Colorado Climate Center's three main missions of climate research, data collection, and education and outreach. His current research includes using machine learning to better understand errors in annual water supply forecasts in Colorado, modeling future weather extremes in Colorado, and using a mix of observed and model data to determine whether we can grow more wine grapes in Colorado. Peter, thank you for being here today. I look forward to your testimony as well. And last but not least, Mr. Alexander Frank is the Director of Water Resources and Senior Counsel for the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. Alex has over a decade of experience working on the Colorado River and other western water challenges. In his role with the TRCP, Alex leads the organization's national freshwater policy efforts, focusing on issues ranging from the Clean Water Act to securing federal funding to increase watershed conservation and restoration projects benefiting fish and wildlife. Thank you for being here today, Alex. Thank you for making the trip. I look forward to your testimony. Again, I want to thank all our witnesses for being here today. As a reminder, we ask you to keep your testimony to 5 minutes each. Any written testimony will be submitted for the record. You may hear me gavel should your time expire. I'm inclined to be a little generous this morning. And Mr. Sakata, please proceed with your testimony. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Senator and Chairman Bennet. Thank you, Ranking Member Marshall. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks to the staff as well. As you said, my name is Robert Sakata. Our family has a farm in Brighton, Colorado, and I'm privileged to serve as the Ag Water Policy Advisor for the Colorado Department of Agriculture. First, as you did, welcome everybody to the city of Burlington. It's a pleasure to have you all here. Thanks to your wonderful staff, all the hard work that they did to organize this, and thanks to Chairwoman Stabenow for also allowing a field hearing to be here. We really appreciate all the work the committee is doing. I'm very humbled, honored, and really intimidated to be here today to lead off the discussion. But we'll do my best to start us off with a broad overview of the challenges that I see agriculture is facing in the arid West. To highlight the scope of the problem facing us, I refer to the USDA Ag Census. The most recent one indicates that over the most recent 25-year reporting period, Colorado has actually lost over 1 million acres of irrigated lands. And that accounts for, surprisingly enough, 80% of the irrigated land reduction across the entire United States. There is a tipping point, and I think we're approaching it. What's causing this reduction? I'll highlight 4 factors. The first is our changing climate. The rising temperatures are not only increasing irrigation, municipal, and industrial needs, but is drying the soils, leading to less water reaching our streams and rivers. This is also putting much more stress on our mountain watersheds, making the work on watershed protection and forest health imperative. Second is the increasing municipal and industrial demand due to increasing population growth. The Colorado Demographer's Office indicates that growth is forecasted to continue to grow, and most of that growth is going to be around the current population centers. Third are the efforts across the state to manage our groundwater resources. Prime examples are here in the Republican River and the Rio Grande Basin. You will hear from the leaders in these efforts. I have the utmost respect for their dedication to achieving the goals that they have set, especially considering how arduous a process and effort that is. In Colorado, as you know, the state owns the water. It allocates that water for beneficial use based on the seniority of water rights, a system called prior appropriations. Our state has worked very hard to do this fairly, to protect senior water rights holders and to be in compliance with compact agreements with our neighboring states. This has been and will continue to be challenging, expensive, and painful for agriculture, as farm and ranch families are battling on the front lines of this water scarcity. A personal example on our farm happened on May 8th of 2006, when the state engineer ordered over 440 alluvial groundwater wells to be shut down in the South Platte Basin because they were found to have inadequate augmentation plans. We had 4 of those wells on our property, and we just watched those crops wither away and die that year. Finally, the most important factor why irrigated lands are decreasing is due to the tough financial situations most farmers and ranchers are in. The USDA Economic Research Service reports that out of each food dollar spent, only 7.9 cents makes it back to farm production. This 7.9 cents is the foundation of our food supply and is carrying the rest of society on its back. We need to make smart investments in agriculture to protect our future. In my written testimony, I provide an example on our farm where we invested in new equipment in hopes of improving soil health, but how costly a mistake that first year was for us. But we were lucky. We survived. Other farmers aren't as lucky. I've had the opportunity to travel across the state and see firsthand the variety of challenges farmers and ranchers are facing. What amazes me is their ingenuity and determination to stay in farming. What is perfectly clear to me, too, is that there is no one activity, no one action, or single farm practice that is the solution. The strength of Colorado agriculture is our diversity, whether it is the high elevation pastures where flood irrigation is providing late season return flows to support the environment, or drip irrigated vegetables pushing the irrigation efficiency to the limit. Each plays an important role in the system as a whole and shouldn't be discounted. The COVID-19 pandemic revealed the dangers of a limited supply chain. This highlights the need for us to build resilience in our food system. An important way to do that is to support local agriculture. In my written testimony, we'll find examples of the local effective programs helping farmers and ranchers adapt to the aridification we are seeing, and you will be hearing about some of that work later today. As the Ag Water Policy Advisor, I commit to work with our tribal, federal, state, and local governments, as well as collaborate with academic institutions, farmers and ranchers, their communities, and conservation partners, not only across our state, but across the region, to find ways to maintain adaptive farm and ranch systems. In closing, thank you for all the work that you do. Thanks in particular for your support for improving rural mental health. As stresses in our agricultural communities are greater than ever, it's important that we focus on this. Moving forward, I hope that you will commit to increasing your support of the valuable locally led initiatives like those of our conservation partners and those in the Colorado Department of Agriculture that you will hear more about from our Commissioner of Ag. It is this local expertise, knowledge, and dedication that provides the best opportunity for success. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert, for that excellent start to the hearing. Mr. Goebel, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Senator Bennet. Senator Marshall, thanks again for holding this hearing. I consider it an honor and a privilege to give my testimony to you all today. As Senator... Yeah, of course. As Senator Bennet said, my name is Peter Goebel, and I'm a climatologist at the Colorado Climate Center at Colorado State University in Fort Collins. My professional background is in researching climate change and climate variability, as well as water availability in Colorado and the western United States. The Colorado State Climate Office has a 3-pillar mission of 1, data collection. We run an agricultural weather station network similar to the one you'll hear about in just a few minutes from Kansas. 2 is climate research. And then 3 is education and outreach. So I've had plenty of chances to discuss climate change and climate variability with folks all across the state, including farmers. Our office recently completed a study that was funded by the Colorado Water Conservation Board, in which we synthesized the observed and projected changes across the state in temperature, precipitation, water resources, and natural hazards. I want to thank my colleague Dr. Becky Bollinger for leading this effort, as well as state climatologist Russ Schumacher and Jeff Lucas of Lucas Climate for their enormous roles in writing this report. You don't have to study Colorado's climate long to know that farming and ranching here is not for the faint of heart. We rely on an average of only 15 to 20 inches of precipitation here in eastern Colorado to grow our crops. That's only about half of what falls over America's heartland in the area that Senator Marshall was talking about supporting cover crops earlier. We also know that precipitation is highly variable from year to year. A wet year like 2015 will bring over 25 inches of precipitation right here in Burlington, Colorado, whereas a dry year like 2002 brings less than 9 inches and is disastrous. A poor crop like that can really destroy a farmer's profit margins, and a poor year of forage can force ranchers to make difficult decisions about whether or not to cull their herd. Moreover, our precipitation here in Colorado does not all fall as cold-soaking million-dollar rains. Sometimes it's the severe thunderstorm that's bounties run off the field before they get to soak into the soil. Sometimes it's hail that shreds the local crops. And sometimes it might be a spring blizzard that threatens livestock during calving season. One other lesson our climate data tells us is that our climate is warming, a trend that's consistent with warming temperatures around the globe and primarily driven by anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases. The National Centers for Environmental Information shows us that our average temperatures here in Colorado have warmed by 2.9 Fahrenheit over the last 125 years, and that trend has accelerated since the 1980s. Precipitation has not significantly increased or decreased long term. However, it is again highly variable, and we've certainly had more than our fair share of drought recently. And on top of that, with the warmer temperatures, we're seeing lower snowpack values in winter and spring across the western US, which is a very important resource as that snowmelt is irrigation water for many farmers and ranchers across the region when it melts in the spring and summer. Furthermore, these hotter summers that we're experiencing also have an impact on our water balance. Hotter weather raises evaporation rates and transpiration rates and can lead to crops losing the soil moisture underneath them more quickly. Sometimes in the blistering heat, the crops simply shut down. Hotter summers indeed do lead to more frequent and severe droughts, which decrease crop yields and hurt the bottom line of our honest, hardworking farmers. The wet years aren't without challenges either. 2023 ended up setting records for severe weather reports across Colorado. We set records for the most 1, 2, 3, and 4-inch diameter hail events across the state. And I've actually brought with me a mold of our previous record hailstone from 2019, which occurred just down the road in Bethune, Colorado. Last year, we broke this record with a 5-inch hailstone near Yuma. Of course, the folks near Kansas have told me that this isn't necessarily all that impressive, but it's new for us. This all sounds a little bit grim, but I do want to leave with a message of hope here. The impacts of climate change can be combated through both mitigation and adaptation. From a mitigation standpoint, renewable energy resources have become much more cost competitive over the last 10 years. Here in America, we're emitting carbon at rates below what we emitted 20 years ago. And around the globe, we're emitting carbon at rates below what climate scientists put into their climate models as the business as usual scenario 15 years ago. We've come a long way, but we still have lots of work to do. Humans are also highly adaptable creatures. By continuing to study, update, and adhere to the best crop and land management practices, we can continue to thrive in the face of intensifying natural hazards. Finally, as a scientist, I have to use this opportunity to advocate the importance of long-term data collection. Long-term, consistent climate observations are the backbone of our understanding of climate globally and right here at home. It's vital that we continue to invest in networks like the National Weather Service's Cooperative Observer Network, state mesonets like the one we run and the one you'll hear more about from Kansas, and even community science efforts such as the Community Collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Network that allow folks from all walks of life to contribute to our understanding of weather and climate. Together, we can learn to adapt and ensure that our food system is resilient to an ever-changing environment. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Goebel. And Ms. Owen, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Bennet. Good morning. My name is Connie Owen, and I am the director of the Kansas Water Office. And I would like to thank you, Chairman Bennet and Ranking Member Marshall, and your staffs and both states for the partnerships that we have in many levels and for the ability to appear before you today. The Kansas Water Office is located in Topeka, Kansas. Our office is the state policy, planning, and coordination agency for all water issues in Kansas. A flagship responsibility of our office is the development of the Kansas Water Plan. One of the 5 guiding principles of the Kansas Water Plan is reducing our vulnerability to extreme events, which includes drought, flood, and climate change. In recent years, the increasing severity of drought in Kansas magnifies the urgency of the need to address this threat. The Kansas Water Office is responsible for monitoring drought and assembling the state drought response team to recommend to the governor to issue a new drought declaration which makes counties eligible for assistance depending on the level of drought intensity. The latest drought declaration was issued just June 10th, 2024. Although this declaration is not nearly as dire as in some recent years, the forecast for the coming summer is for warmer and drier conditions. In Kansas, the economic driver for most of the state is agriculture. In a drought, the lost income stream can be felt down the supply chain, affecting entire communities. The impact can lead to higher food prices and food scarcity. Ultimately, national security interests are at risk. Just 2 years ago, Kansas suffered one of the driest periods on record since 1895. Many areas in Kansas saw records broken for the least amount of rainfall since record keeping began. That year, extreme heat and wind contributed to agricultural devastation in Kansas. The summer of 2022, the intense heat and lack of precipitation, for example, was responsible for the deaths of thousands of cattle in several Kansas counties. Kansas suffered another extreme drought, which peaked in 2012, the warmest and one of the driest years on record. The Kansas Department of Agriculture estimated the 2012 drought caused more than $3 billion in drought-related crop losses in Kansas. More than $1.3 billion in crop insurance indemnity payments for failed commodities were paid to Kansans in 2012. Temperature increases in the state are also projected to increase the frequency and severity of wildfires. In December 2021, the warmest December to date in Kansas, devastating wildfires burned over 165,000 acres of land in central Kansas. The increased need for water also worsens the severe depletion of the Ogallala Aquifer. According to the National Drought Mitigation Center, droughts also result in negative environmental and social impacts. Coping with drought also presents a challenge for public water suppliers. The Kansas Water Office is responsible for the management of state-controlled conservation storage in 15 federal reservoirs that serve 2/3 of the state's population. 245 water systems or cities in Kansas rely, at least in part, on the federal reservoirs in Kansas. Within this group, the largest population centers include Johnson County, Wichita, Topeka, Manhattan, and Salina. Many of these communities survive drought only because of support from federal reservoir releases. Reservoirs filling with silt makes it harder to help with drought, however. The increase in sediment shrinks the storage capacity for water. Drought also affects communities who rely on other sources of water. The small town of Caney, population less than 2,000, relies primarily on the flow of the Little Caney River, which virtually ran dry in 2023. The town employed dramatic major restrictions. The situation improved, but the city is facing expensive infrastructure improvements to solve the problem. In summary, droughts in Kansas have been increasing in frequency and intensity. Every sector, including agriculture, municipalities, industry, recreation, and the environment, is experiencing and will continue to experience negative impacts of drought. The fact that the state's water supplies are shrinking, from depletion of the Ogallala Aquifer to sedimentation of federal reservoirs, only accelerates this crisis. Adaptation and planning for resilience will be critical. Thank you very much for this opportunity to testify today.
Thank you, Ms. Owen. Mr. Redmond, please go ahead.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Bennett and Ranking Member Marshall, for this opportunity to speak in front of you all this morning. My name's Chip Redmond. I'm a meteorologist at Kansas State University, and I run the Kansas Mesonet Manager. Thanks again for this opportunity, and I'm going to speak today a little bit about the drought in the High Plains, and talk a little bit on the Mesonet itself. You know, the High Plains, as already mentioned, can be an area of extreme vulnerability of both extreme wet and extreme dry. When we look at climate over time, we're talking about averaging over a 30-year period. Typically, over these extremes, though, drought tends to be the most impactful. Last year did bring drought relief to a lot of the High Plains in 2023. Unfortunately, this also shifted the drought further east into central Kansas. Like Connie mentioned, places like Caney had significant issues last year. Drought never completely goes away. It's a part of our climate, and it tends to shift and move as you go through time, and doesn't typically stick to one location for usually more than several years. As we moved through 2023, that relief was brought by the change in the eastern Pacific equatorial water temperatures. That's what we call the ENSO region, or El Nino Southern Oscillation. We transitioned from what was a 3-year period of La Nina that brought a lot of that drought into El Nino that thankfully brought much needed moisture for this region. That happened in the spring of last year, so a little bit over a year ago. Unfortunately, that surplus of moisture was short-lived. As of early this June, we saw that El Nino condition in the East Pacific already decrease in warmer than normal temperatures back to neutral conditions, with projections of potentially La Nina redeveloping by the fall of 2024. An additional oscillation that we look at typically is called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. It's a 10-year decadal transition, so it usually is very persistent. It can also have a significant impact on the North American climate. The Pacific Decadal Oscillation has been very negative, basically cooler waters along the northern Pacific coast of Canada and the America, and warmer water out in the middle. That negative Pacific Decadal Oscillation tends to strengthen or enhance the La Nina conditions. Unfortunately, that means continued drought concerns. And when we look at La Nina potentially redeveloping, it appears this period of increased moisture has been short-lived, and drought emergence seems very likely as we move further into the summer of 2024. As a result, we need to consider some of the longer-term trends of drought as well. For example, periods between rainfall events are increasing in length. We typically consider 1/10 of an inch or 0.1 inches a wetting rain that has impact on the soils and crops in a positive way. Just looking at Tribune, they have a National Weather Service Cooperative Observer site there. Those durations and lengths of periods without rainfall have increased by over 25% since the 1890s. Unfortunately, the rainfall that we have seen with that has also increased. So while we're having longer periods of no precipitation, we're seeing periods of heavier rain when we do get moisture. And just with 1-inch heavier rain events, we've seen a 20% increase at Tribune at that very important National Weather Service cooperative site. So again, heavier rainfall, but longer periods of dry between them. This makes agriculture very challenging because when we get that heavier rain, it tends to run off and not infiltrate into the soil, and then we have drought right after that. That makes higher demands on natural resources like the Ogallala Aquifer. The need for more efficient water use has increased the demands for accurate weather and climate data, especially considering places like Tribune's NWS Co-op that we rely heavily on for these climate records. Unfortunately, since 2000, Kansas has lost about 36% of their long-term cooperative observers in the state. This makes networks like the Kansas Mesonet or the Colorado Agricultural Meteorological Network, or COAGMET, extremely important because they're filling the role that these co-op observers cannot as we move forward. Not only do they measure critical things like temperature and precipitation, but they also measure other variables that are extremely important to agriculture, like solar radiation, wind, and soil moisture. Another use is, as Connie mentioned, there's been ag issues with livestock. Back in 2019 alone, the Kansas Mesonet data supported 1,600 ag livestock, or USDA livestock indemnity program claims that resulted in $7.6 million back into producers' hands that year alone. There's a lot of other programs that rely heavily on weather data, of which I won't digress here, but I will say that the National Mesonet program is an oversight program that aggregates all the Kansas Mesonet and CoAgMet and other networks in the nation together. This is pivotal in keeping continued good long-term climate and weather data records continuing and sustain them long-term. This makes things like the National Weather Service Reauthorization Act and National Mesonet Authorization Act critical in sustaining these networks. Thank you for this opportunity to speak today on behalf of the Kansas Mesonet and the Kansas Climate Office.
Thank you, Mr. Redmond, for making the trip. Mr. Funk.
Chairman Bennett, Ranking Member Marshall, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. My name is Alexander Funk. I'm the Director of Water Resources and Senior Counsel with the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, or TRCP. Established in 2002, the TRCP's mission is to guarantee all Americans a quality place to hunt and fish. The TRCP is a coalition-building organization that unites and amplifies the voices of hunters and anglers around issues that affect fish and wildlife conservation, habitat, and access. TRCP encourages Congress to move quickly to pass a bipartisan farm bill to ensure funding and technical assistance are available to increase the pace and scale of innovative drought adaptation and mitigation efforts benefiting agriculture, fish, and wildlife. Failure to pass a farm bill in this Congress could jeopardize the availability of certain USDA conservation programs, which would be a significant blow to addressing ongoing drought conditions in Colorado, Kansas, and other western states. These programs are voluntary, incentive-based, effective, and if available, can go a long way towards addressing water supply challenges affecting both agriculture and fish and wildlife. Hunting and fishing play an important economic role nationally and here in Colorado and in Kansas. Drought and climate change threaten the availability of hunting and fishing, and as such, our economy in many ways. These drought-related impacts are not just limited to fish. Droughts are known to reduce waterfowl and upland game bird habitats due to declines in suitable habitat and food. Drought and other extreme weather conditions, disease, human impacts such as roads and fences are also known to contribute to declines in big game populations such as mule deer. The Farm Bill can play a vital role in addressing these impacts and broader water supply challenges affecting western states, and can do so through a multi-title approach, meaning that beyond the conservation title, there are ample opportunities in the forestry, research, rural development, and other titles to address water-related challenges. For example, most Westerners receive their water from forests. Forests are home to our natural water infrastructure, the source watershed streams, wetlands, and meadows that sustain drinking and irrigation water across the West. The Farm Bill presents an opportunity to enhance the conservation and restoration of these headwater forests through programs such as strengthening the Water Source Protection Program, which allows the Forest Service to enter into agreements with water users to develop and implement source water plans and actions from fuels management to riparian restoration efforts, both of which can help enhance water availability. That said, the conservation title can play a great role in addressing drought conditions, and there are several opportunities to help Western farmers and ranchers. The Conservation Reserve Program, for example, can help address drought in multiple ways by encouraging the restoration of perennial cover on environmentally sensitive agricultural lands, which in turn reduces water loss to evaporation and increases water infiltration rates. The same cover provides essential wildlife habitat and improves water quality. However, many aspects of this program have not been updated since the 80s when it was first established, including the ability to update rental rates to reflect the program's ecological value and encourage greater program enrollment. Other challenges include a lack of cost share for managing CRP grazing lands. The 2018 Farm Bill also, for the first time, authorized NRCS to enter into EQIP contracts with water management entities, such as groundwater management districts and ditch companies, to implement watershed-scale conservation and efficiency measures. TRCP supported this provision given the potential for these watershed-scale efforts to benefit fish and wildlife. Despite the promise of this change, there have been significant challenges with implementation of this provision, ranging from adjusted gross income restrictions to complicated contracting and eligibility requirements to lack of NRCS staff capacity and training to implement the program, as well as a lack of dedicated funding to support these investments. In early 2023, USDA released a Western Water and Working Lands Framework outlining challenges and conservation approaches to support Western farmers and ranchers, including the modernization of irrigation infrastructure, improving water supply forecast frameworks, and restoring streams and wetlands. Still, unlike other targeted USDA frameworks, this Western framework lacks dedicated resources to support implementation. We encourage Congress and USDA to continue working collaboratively to ensure these adequate resources and capacity are available to implement these existing measures. So in closing, thank you again, Senator Bennet, Senator Marshall, other members of the subcommittee for the opportunity today to speak to you about the drought and climate change impacts facing Western agriculture and our Western watersheds. The TRCP and our hunting and fishing community partners are ready to work with you to craft a farm bill for agriculture, fish, and wildlife, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you. Thank you all for your excellent testimony. Appreciate your being here. I'm going to start with a few questions. I'm going to try to keep it to 5 minutes, and I'll turn it over to Senator Marshall, and we'll see if we need to sweep up at the end. But thank you. That was extremely helpful. Robert, you are both, as every Colorado farmer is, but you're both a farmer and a water expert. And I think if you could boil it all down, when you think about the future of Colorado, the next quarter century, or however you want to think about it, what is it that you're most worried about with respect to drought, and how should we be thinking about that?
Well, thank you, Chairman Bennet. I guess first I'd like to preface that, I've siphoned many siphon tubes and shoveled many furrows and changed a few gearboxes on the center pivots, but I'd call myself more a water groupie than a water expert, just so you know. But like you said, I think I'm in a great position where I've been on the farming side and now on the policy side, so I really appreciate being able to think about this in the broad range. I'm really optimistic. As you travel across the country, we see how dedicated farmers and ranchers are, how hard working they are. But I think just like on our farm, and it may sound kind of counterintuitive, I think we need to be willing to support experiments that are going to fail. It doesn't make sense, right? You're going to support something that doesn't work. But really, that's what's happening with farmers and ranchers, that we don't have that financial buffer anymore. We can't take risks, and change is hard. So if you're going to ask us to change and try something new, we'll need assistance to mitigate those risks. On our farm, like I said, we invested in some no-till equipment, and the first year we made mistakes, and it was a financial nightmare. But luckily, we were able to sell some of our vegetable equipment and make it up. So again, it doesn't make sense, but I think we need to be able to fund experiments that may fail.
That makes sense to me. Speaking of incentives, and Mr. Funk, you mentioned some of the difficulties we've been having with the RCPP, which has been a concern of mine. I think that the program's got a lot of potential. Within the Conservation Reserve Program, CRP, which you also mentioned, rental payments are based on the ground value of the land, as you know. So we're paying higher rates for more productive land, not necessarily the most environmentally sensitive ground. Could you describe how the CRP payment structure could better drive key wildlife, climate, or soil health outcomes, like keeping the topsoil in place here in eastern Colorado or western Kansas?
Thank you for the question, Senator Bennet. So we can actually absolutely do a better job of incentivizing positive outcomes through the Conservation Reserve Program, and I would highlight two large issues, one being that the annual payment limit for the program has not been updated since 1985, and especially when you're facing regions with high farmland values and adjustments for inflation, it really cramps down on enrollment opportunities, especially for higher paying practices like the State Acres for Wildlife Enhancement Program, which does help support riparian buffers and wetland restoration that help support drought resilience. Also, as you just said, rental rates are based on acreage, dryland rental rates, and soil productivity, and therefore with regions that have lower soil productivity, like eastern Colorado, the implication there is that farmers and producers that would like to potentially participate in CRP potentially are faced with those lower rental rates compared to other regions, and that really does affect enrollment rates on a whole. And when you combine that with drought and extreme weather, that puts soils in this region at significant risk of either further degradation, which again creates a positive feedback loop of that soil's ability to maintain moisture and to help farmers adapt to less water supply generally. So to address these challenges, we would consider, reforms that potentially make CRP work from Colorado to Iowa. We need a program that works for all producers across the country, not just targeted regions. and certainly not disadvantage enrollment of highly erodible lands. And I know there's several proposals actively discussing that, and we'd be happy to talk to your office more about
Thank you.
some of those
Well, we
options.
look forward to that continuing conversation. I hear about it all the time when I'm out here on the Eastern Plains. Mr. Goebel, I'm going to ask you one question, then I'll turn it over to my colleague here. We heard a little bit of testimony at the outset here about what the effect on our economy might be as a result of everything that we're facing, and I wonder how Colorado Climate's Office is seeing extreme drought or severe weather events affect agricultural production in this state and regionally. Could you tell us what those trends look like?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for the question, Senator Bennet. When it comes to agricultural production, thankfully, for the most part, advances in crop genetics to this point have outpaced the degradations that we would expect in yields from increasing drought. But we do absolutely see that in drier years like 2020 or 2022 recently, that the drought has an adverse impact on yields. So that is something that we're very much concerned about, especially as these hotter than the historically normal summers become more consistent. I would also add that we're very concerned with the way that a warming climate changes our hydrologic cycle, where even if we do get as much precipitation as we have historically, more of it evaporates or doesn't make it into the soils and end up actually being effective precipitation. So that's definitely something we're
Thank you.
concerned
Senator
with.
Marshall?
Yeah.
Yep, well, thank you. My first question's for Ms. Owen. Ms. Owen, as you know, Kansas has seen an invasion of invasive species, salt cedars, different species lining our rivers, sucking and removing water. And we've done several pilot programs where we've removed cedars and salt cedars from those rivers and return flow to creek basins that we've not seen water flow for decades. But my farmers and ranchers complain that due to the lack of flexibility in some of the EQIP programs, if you don't take on all the rules, you can't do that particular practice. So can you just speak to what practices could be supported by the federal government in mitigating the reduction of surface water flow?
Thank you for the question, Senator Marshall. And as you know, there is an interrelationship between surface water and groundwater. So when groundwater is being used excessively, it pulls from the stream and vice versa when there's an alluvial connection. So in effect, helping to restore surface flow is often a factor, is often impacted by the use of groundwater. So one of the best things we can do to return surface flow is to strengthen groundwater aquifers and reduce the draw from the aquifer. So the federal government does have roles to play in helping to reduce aquifer use. And one way is to help with water right buyouts for those who are willing to sell so that we can reduce the demand on the aquifer. There are mechanisms for supporting fallowing techniques. One very important aspect that the federal government is currently involved with, we have some cost share programs in Kansas, is supporting the use of new technologies for producers to use. For example, soil moisture probes that can tell the producers when they need to irrigate and when they don't. That allows for more precision management and saves an awful lot of water and reduces the demand on the aquifer. And another thing that we hear a lot from producers, and I can't speak to this personally, but what I'm hearing is that the crop insurance programs at times encourage the use of water when it's not needed. So for example, if early in the season they know their crop will fail, for some reason, whether it's waiting for an adjuster or an agent, they're required to continue to water a crop they know will not survive.
Yep, thanks.
So some of those tweaks could be made to the crop insurance program. So those are a few mechanisms the federal
Ms.
government
Owen.
can make.
The other, I'm on this kick on this invasive species, something I learned thanks to my friends at KLA and others, is that by removing these invasive species, it actually improves the carbon sink of the soil as well. So that's great to know. We'll turn to Mr. Funk for a question for you. And continuing on this theme of needing some looser guardrails, one of the concerns from the IRA Farm Bill, the IRA in the Farm Bill, are some of the climate sideboards that they're a little bit too tight for us to utilize. In your testimony, you mentioned irrigation lining and piping as two conservation practices that help reduce unnecessary pumping and irrigation systems. Do you have any good, I guess, environmental reason why irrigation piping is an approved practice under the IRA, while irrigation lining is not, when they both could help reduce fuel from reducing pumping?
Thanks for the question, Senator Marshall. My understanding of sort of why certain practices have been added to the NRCS eligibility list of the IRA funds largely stemmed from basically whether or not NRCS had an existing methodology to account for those carbon sequestration benefits associated with the practice. And when the initial list was released in fiscal year 2023, they lacked that data for a lot of irrigation modernization improvements. That said, they have offered 2 public comment processes since then, and several partners, including us, submitted data showing that some of those on-farm efficiency practices do have carbon benefits, and they were added. That said, a lot of that, it seems like there's still a burden of proof on sort of the entities sort of saying like, hey, there is adequate data for this, and then it's up to NRCS to kind of weigh that data. But I can't speak to how much like they put towards like any one practice or the other.
Thanks. I'll finish up with a question for Mr. Redmond. Mr. Redmond, growing up, our lives stopped over the noon lunch hour and the weather report at 10:15, 10:30, but now we have 24/7 access to the weather. What would be most helpful to my producers is long-term weather reports, and not just how much, but when the rain is going to fall. It would impact us, should I be planting soybeans or corn this year? Maybe I should go to Milo, which uses even less water. I'm not sure if you all call it sorghum or Milo here, but we still call it Milo in Kansas as well. What does the opportunities and the improvements in long-term forecasts look like as a meteorologist?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Senator Bennet or Senator Marshall. So there's a couple things to consider. Our technology in computers has gone much, much further, whether from the local modeling component at the state level to large-scale global modeling has greatly improved our forecasting where, we used to only be able to predict the weather for several days out, and now we're 14, 30 days out pretty consistently. That combined with surface observations, things like the Kansas Mesonet or the National Weather Service Cooperative Network, they measure more data than we've ever measured before. We even have airplanes that
Well,
are
what's
measuring.
keeping us from 30 days is not enough, okay? I need 90 days or 6 months.
And so the knowledge gained from those observations has helped us gain understanding in climate oscillations such as ENSO or the Pacific Decadal Oscillation that help us really get good forecasts out months in advance. And so when we look at this summer, for instance, we're already projecting out that drought is going to develop across the high plains this summer, and we expect below normal precipitation as a result to help people make better decisions like that. And I think that we've really come a long ways in that to the point where from the state climate perspective, we're yielding those questions to producers and we're providing on-the-ground support.
Thank you.
Do you have anything else?
I'm good.
Thank you very much to the panel for your excellent testimony, and we're going to transition now to the next group of witnesses. Please, and I would say thank you to the audience's patience as well. Thanks.
there. I'm gonna check that thing. It flutters in and out, so like after about 30 seconds,
This is where we're starting right here. Are you ready, Roger? If people could grab their seats, we'll start the next panel. Thank you very much for being here. Commissioner Kate Greenberg is our first witness. She's the Commissioner of Agriculture for the Colorado Department of Agriculture. She's the first woman to serve in this role. Commissioner Greenberg has worked in agriculture for more than 15 years. Her department serves producers that are operating over 36,000 farms and ranches in Colorado. She's a member of numerous state boards and commissions, past president of the Western U.S. Agricultural Trade Association, and former chair of the Western Association of State Departments of Agriculture. She's also the recipient of the Emerging Conservation Leader Award from Western Resource Advocates. Thank you for being here today, Kate. It's great to have you, and I look forward to your testimony. Another commissioner, Mr. Don Brown, serves as director of the Republican River Water Conservation District and is a third-generation farmer in Yuma County, Colorado. There, he's run several successful businesses while spending most of his career managing and growing his family's farming operations of irrigated crops, dryland crops, and cattle. Don preceded Kate as Colorado's Commissioner of Agriculture under then Governor John Hickenlooper. He is active in numerous agricultural organizations and currently serves as a member of the Farm, Ranch, and Rural Communities Federal Advisory Committee to the EPA Administrator. I'm grateful for him to be with us at the hearing today, and I look forward to your testimony, Don. Senator Cleve Simpson, Mr. Simpson is the General Manager of the Rio Grande Water Conservation District. He also serves as Colorado State Senator representing 14 counties in southern and southwest Colorado. I know a little bit about traveling this beautiful state of ours from every corner to the other corner, and I can tell you that Cleve Simpson seems to know the same routine, and I know he's leaving today to go to Montrose, so this is a busy day for him. I'm grateful that he was able to fit us in. Senator Simpson was born and raised in Alamosa, Colorado. He's the fourth generation of his family to farm and ranch in Colorado's San Luis Valley. As general manager of the district, he works across the San Luis Valley to address the water security issues in the Rio Grande Basin. He has served as representative to the Rio Grande Basin Roundtable and the statewide Interbasin Compact Committee. Thank you again for being here today, Cleve. I look forward to your testimony, and then Senator Marshall. Please introduce your witnesses, and then we'll get started.
Well, I'm honored to introduce two Kansans to this panel. First is Mr. Earl Lewis. Mr. Lewis is the Chief Engineer and Director of the Kansas Department of Agriculture's Division of Water Resources, which administers some 30 laws and responsibilities, including the Kansas Water Appropriation Act, which governs how water is allocated and used. The chief engineer oversees policies related to these laws, including water structures, stream obstruction, and represents Kansas in interstate water matters. Mr. Lewis graduated from the University of Kansas with a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering. He's a licensed professional engineer. In the state of Kansas, he and his wife Sherry live in Topeka and have two sons. And then next, I'm honored to introduce Mr. Pat Jansen, who resides on a farm that he operates with his family some 45 miles east of Dodge in south central Kansas. The majority of their operation consists of irrigated crop producing corn, soybeans, wheat, milo, and grass hay. The farm also has a cow-calf stocker cattle unit, as well as providing custom farming and custom irrigation services. Mr. Jansen has been extensively involved in irrigation efficiency work for the last 15 years on his operation and through his association with WaterPack. We look forward to both of your testimonies. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Greenberg, please get us started.
Thank you, Chairman Bennet and Ranking Member Marshall, for the opportunity to speak with you here in Burlington, Colorado. My name is Kate Greenberg, and I serve as Colorado's Commissioner of Agriculture at the Colorado Department of Agriculture under Governor Jared Polis. CDA serves as a partner with our agricultural communities in meeting current and future challenges. These challenges include everything from drought and climate change, water and soil health, to labor, market access, foreign animal disease response, and training the next generation of farmers and ranchers. Our focus in tackling these challenges has been on building producer-led, voluntary, and incentive-based solutions. Over the past 5 years, we have worked with farmers and ranchers to create the Colorado Soil Health Program to advance stewardship, the resilience of the soil to extreme weather events, and enhance farm profitability. CDA received a $25 million USDA Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities grant for soil health, which helped us enroll over 500 producers in the program and advance new soil health practices on over 65,000 acres. We created the Agricultural Drought and Climate Resilience Office to mitigate the impacts of a warming climate. We've expanded our renewable energy program to include agrivoltaic research, such as integrating crop and livestock production into existing solar farms and using bifacial solar panels as fence rows and windbreaks. We are providing technical assistance for USDA's Rural Energy for America, or REAP program. And beyond conservation, we have been expanding market access for producers both at home and abroad, with a keen interest in markets that reward climate-smart practices. We've doubled our support for paid internships, created an ag worker outreach program, and issued over $17 million in innovative financing for beginning farmers. We have to do more to set young people up for success in a rapidly changing world. Farmers, ranchers, and agricultural workers are on the front lines of drought and climate change. They feel firsthand the impacts of hotter weather, tougher droughts, more frequent pest cycles, and back-to-back hailstorms, all of which we have seen in just the past few weeks here on the Eastern Plains. We live with drought in the West. What we face now is aridification due to climate change. Conservation, drought, and disaster relief programs must reflect this reality. Federal programs need to be flexible to allow for innovation at the state, local, and producer levels. One way of doing this is by continuing to partner with states to support the programs that we are already implementing, such as we've seen with our soil health and renewable energy programs. Federal programs also need to be tailored to meet regional needs, in our case, the needs of the West. For example, Colorado has been a leader in utilizing voluntary conservation easements to protect agricultural lands, increasing funding for the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, and allowing the program to cover project costs for landowners would allow for greater use of this tool for land and water conservation. The Environmental Quality Incentives Program is a vital partner in our renewable energy efforts. Additional funding, as well as increasing the program's federal matching contribution percentage, would help drive more innovation in rural energy production. We need to ensure that we have a robust technical assistance network delivered by both USDA as well as partners on the ground. The Regional Conservation Partnership Program, or RCPP, is at a point now where we need changes to ensure its continued success. It requires extensive administrative oversight and lacks the administrative support for the program included in the cost, and that can be a big hurdle for applicants. The structure of the Climate Smart Commodities Grant, on the other hand, offers an example of how to improve RCPP, such as including the allowance of administrative funding and technical assistance in the program. Another example of where we've seen flexibility is in CREP. The 2018 Farm Bill provided that dry land agricultural uses may be permitted under the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program with the adoption of best management practices. And while there have been challenges implementing this is an important tool for Colorado to enroll the necessary acres in CREP to meet our interstate compact requirements. Disaster relief programs need to be fully funded to address the losses that producers face due to the increasing frequency and severity of natural disasters, including drought. In order to both encourage building drought and climate resilience and maintain the long-term financial stability of disaster relief programs, we need to focus on incentivizing practices that will be resilient in the future and do so with farmers and ranchers at the table. Finally, we need to continue to make investments in research, incentive programs, and technical assistance that help more farmers and ranchers reduce greenhouse gas emissions, increase carbon sequestration and water conservation, and adapt to a changing climate. This is an investment that must be made at the federal level to ensure continued food and economic security for the country. Our partners at USDA regularly exhibit the kind of partnership and flexibility that make these programs successful. We need to continue to build on these relationships as we adapt federal programs. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss this work with you today and look forward to any questions you have.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate it. Somebody who knows something about dryland crop. Mr. Brown, would you like to go next?
Thank you. Well, thank you, Chairman, and please bear with me today. The summer cold has arrived, and so I will have to, if it's okay. Chairman Bennet and Ranking Member Marshall, it is Milo. You're correct. I'm with you there.
Glad we got that squared away at the outset.
Yeah, we got that squared away, but I'd like to share a bit of my background and where the Milo comment comes from. Is my great-grandfather Andrew Brown homesteaded near Hays, Kansas in 1874, 150 years ago. My grandfather Albert Brown homesteaded in Yuma, Colorado in 1911. So my family has been a part of this high plains for a cumulative couple hundred years. I'm a third generation Yuma County farmer and rancher, fourth generation working with us, and we grow irrigated crops as well as dryland crops, and summer graze several thousand head of yearlings, all which relies on rainfall. I think a little bit of history is important as well. As this arid high plains was settled in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the push westward into Colorado from Kansas was forged by surges forward and rapid retreats. This very county we sit in today lost 36% of its population between 1890 and 1900, and it was not due to disease, it was due to lack of rainfall. There are two fundamental and undeniable facts that still apply today. Dryland farming is completely dependent on rainfall, and those farmers and communities who have some form of irrigation fare much better in times of drought. I'd like to take a moment as director of the Republican River Water Conservation District here in Colorado to talk a moment about the basin itself and the aquifer, which Senator Marshall, you so eloquently defined how large it is. The residents of the Republican River Basin in Colorado, Kansas, and Nebraska suffered from a devastating flood in 1935. And in order to acquire federal funds to build dams, the states agreed on the amount of water each state had to provide downriver. Dramatic expansion of irrigated acreage in the 60s altered flows, and Kansas felt as though they had no choice but to pursue legal action in courts. This led to a final settlement stipulation, and the states agreed each state would be required, per a complex groundwater model, to provide a minimum number of acre-feet of water each year. In 2004, Colorado created the Republican River Water Conservation District, the RRWCD/district, in the state's efforts to comply. And we, as basin users here in northeastern Colorado, have provided almost $120 million of our own money in fees for this effort. In 2016, the three states agreed that since Colorado was struggling to meet the South Fork requirements, that Kansas, in lieu of water, would accept Colorado removing 25,000 acres from irrigation in the South Fork by December of 2029. And the Colorado State Engineer has made it very clear, action is required, the deadlines are real, they're not optional. And that he has the worst case scenario would force him to shut down all high capacity wells here in our portion of the basin in Colorado. The surest method to compliance is retiring irrigated acres in Colorado. And typically those retirement programs require a mix of district and USDA funds. District is using the CREP program, and the EQIP is also beneficial, but has been unreliable due to lack of funding. In 2018, as we get to the dryland farmable CREP, Kansas Secretary of Agriculture and I drafted language for the Farm Bill for that year, which allowed the Secretary to permit dryland farming on qualified acres. Secretary Vilsack authorized FSA to create CP 100, and it allows farmers to continue to farm after they give up their irrigation well. In May of 2023, the USDA announced the producers could enroll irrigated land in CP 100, and you were there at the signing at the Colorado Capitol, Senator Bennet. During negotiations with FSA, we had pointed out that the requirements are too rigorous, and as of today, 1 year later, FSA offices have 0 applications. Thanks to your bipartisan and bicameral support, the CREP Improvement Act, hopefully the compensation hurdle will be remedied. No question, we need this program. Also updating, as has been pointed out earlier, the decades-old CRP payment limitation is a real barrier in helping us retire these and meet these agreements that we've made with Kansas and Nebraska. A couple other things I'd like to comment about that need to be or would like to see remedied is, as pointed out earlier, currently CRP rental rates reward the highly productive land, and for those who have poor lower-yielding soils to enroll, they do not economically work. One of my deepest concerns as a producer is the 1985 version of CRP has morphed into a wildlife program. Prior approved grass stands are often required to be destroyed and replaced. And in a time of climate change and tenuous reestablishment of grasses is extremely difficult. Prior approved grass stands from decades ago should be allowed to remain. I would really like to see, as a producer, the subcommittee continue to focus on drought-related research as it relates to developing increased drought tolerance in existing and new crops. I think it's paramount that innovation be included in all this, but programs which are tried and true should not be abandoned or edited in such a fashion that they become unrecognizable over the years. One should not discard the original purpose of the CRP, forget that providing adequate water to livestock through pipelines and watering facilities is essential, or fail to recognize the need for supporting wise use of the Ogallala Aquifer. On behalf of the RRWCD, I'd like to thank you for having us here today. I'd like to point out that we must not forget the High Plains region is of value to the nation and its food supply. Rural communities are an important part of this nation's fabric. And most importantly of all, acknowledging that if our region is going to survive, our youth must have a reason to stay here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Thank you. Mr. Lewis?
Thank you, Chairman Bennett, Ranking Member Marshall. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today on this panel. My name is Earl Lewis, and I am the Chief Engineer and Director of the Kansas Department of Agriculture's Division of Water Resources. In that role, I and my staff deal with water issues across the state as well as with their neighbors. And just for the record, I'd like to point out that we are no longer in any lawsuits with Colorado, and worked very diligently with my co-panelist, Mr. Brown here to resolve that back in 2016, and Commissioner Greenberg as she came on board as well. I'll go off script for just a minute because I want to echo and reinforce some of Mr. Brown's comments here, especially as it relates to dryland CREP. We see that as a very valuable option, not only for Colorado to comply with the compact obligations they have, but for us to solve a number of our problems within Kansas as well. Dawn has obviously highlighted some of the issues that they're facing. We currently have a dryland CREP proposal sitting in DC at the national office that needs some help to try and get it across the line. We've got producers that are ready to sign up to help us solve some of our water issues, but because of some of the issues that have been highlighted here, it's being held up, and we probably need a little help to try and get that, again, over the line. Again, our primary responsibility is the allocation, management, and regulation of the waters within Kansas, which becomes even more important in times of drought. The federal government plays a vital role in addressing drought across the High Plains, particularly the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Those roles range from data collection to drought response, and I'd like to highlight a couple of things that I think that we're working well but also could be improved. First, the federal government's role in monitoring drought and bringing consistency and evaluation across the entire country is critical to the better preparation and response to drought, as reflected in the drought monitor. While drought is by its nature a slow-moving event, the situation on the ground can change quickly. As such, it is necessary to have the most up-to-date information when that development occurs. I would encourage efforts that allow submittal of additional credible information to the National Drought Monitor so that the full extent of the drought can be properly reflected. We have heard from local constituents, particularly in western Kansas, that the Drought Monitor often underestimates the severity of the situation on the ground, and this can delay access to some emergency programs within USDA. As has been mentioned earlier, the Ogallala Aquifer supports a significant amount of the nation's food and fiber production. As such, conserving and extending the life of the aquifer is critically important to both individual states such as Kansas and Colorado, but as the nation as a whole. For several years, USDA's Agricultural Research Service, led by Bushland, Texas, has been active with research universities in the Ogallala states to coordinate research in areas of monitoring, crop research, water management, and others. I would encourage the subcommittee in Congress to provide adequate resources to expand the ongoing research into other areas and topics. As our water resource declines, producers will need to adapt and move to alternative crops to continue the economic activity that has been vital to the area. Additional research is needed to better understand how to make that happen, as well as development of additional markets and incentives to grow crops like milo, right? We call it milo as well, that use less water and are more drought tolerant. Crop insurance was mentioned in the last panel. I'd like to highlight that as well. It is one of the most important and widely supported programs within the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Like most programs, there can be improvements that can be made. One that's been highlighted, and I would echo, is that there appears to be lack of clarity on the need to continue irrigation of a covered crop at a time when drought has effectively terminated its growth. Producers are often told that they need to continue to irrigate the crop until an adjuster can visit the site in person and confirm the crop is no longer viable. Whether this is a policy issue or an education issue is unclear. We have heard from USDA that that is no longer a policy issue, but it still happens fairly frequently. Additional educational resources are needed to make it available to both the insurers and the producers on how to deal with this situation. Putting water on a crop that's already died is in nobody's interest. USDA Rural Development serves a critical purpose in our local rural water districts and small towns. So droughts not only affect farmers and ranchers, but our small communities as well. One change that I think could be helpful in rural development is when a catastrophe happens, we have a drought emergency in a local community. Rural development does have options available for either expanding or extending a transmission line or development of a new well. However, the caps and the time to get those resources often don't match up with the ability of the local community to pay or the situation that's happening on the ground and the need to respond quickly. So I'd encourage the caps to be increased, the covered practices to be expanded, and the red tape to be reduced so that we can get that money to the people that need it more quickly. In summary, addressing the impact of drought is across the High Plains takes all of our efforts, whether it's the federal, state, local governments, or individual producers. It takes all of us to work together to find solutions that are going to serve our farmers, ranchers, and local communities. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and be happy to answer questions at the
Well
appropriate time.
said. Thank you, Mr. Lewis. Mr. Jensen, you're next.
Okay, I did not disclose this in my bio, but I am a member of PETA. That stands for People Eating Tasty Animals. All right, I've been asked to speak to CREP initially. CREP has met its initial goals in water-stressed areas where we'd already experienced depletion in aquifers.
Could I ask you, Mr. just to lean in a little bit to your microphone? Thank you very much.
Okay. The CREP program has achieved its initial goals of going into stressed aquifers, stabilizing water quality and the water quantity available there. Since then, we've tried to move this program into areas that still had abundant water and were viable for irrigation. At that point, we started running into issues with funding. Currently in Stafford County, Kansas, an acre irrigated ground is worth $7,000 an acre. A comparable acre of dry land is worth about $2,400 an acre. That's a $4,600 spread in property value, and currently the CREP price for that ground is $2,250 an acre, or about 51% of what the fair market value of that water is at an auction. Other issues we've got is presently we do not have a dry land CREP option in Kansas. To sprawl this one a little bit, in the 1980s in my part of the world when the initial CRP program came out, it effectively skipped a generation of producers because there was no place for those young people to go and farm to expand their family operations. So I would urge a bit of caution there because CRP rental rates also impact what landowners expect to receive for ground that's still in production. So that can be an unintended consequence of that. Okay, we also have no option in CREP for partial water right retirements. We really need flexibility in the type of covers acceptable for grass seeding, specifically on irrigated ground in sandy areas. We need the ability to be able to use established alfalfa stands as cover for these crops, rather than going in on ground that no longer has access to irrigation water, destroying an existing crop, and then attempting to produce something else to stabilize and protect that land from soil erosion. And I found out this week that to make any modifications at a dry land program to the CREP in Kansas, we now have to go through an environmental impact assessment. So we continue to make things more complicated rather than making things simpler and easier to implement. And crop insurance, it's definitely necessary. We had a board meeting of a cooperative I serve on, and for the second year in a row, our wheat receipts are 30% of our 15-year average in our area. So maintaining crop insurance is critical to keeping a viable national food security. We seem to be suffering from a disconnect in communications and culture within NRCS, and I don't want this to come off as I'm down on everything they're doing, because I'm not. But we've gotten away from our NRCS offices, our NRCS policies being drafted by farm boys with a college degree who wanted to make things better. We now have biologists, people with other specialties, extremely intelligent people, but they don't have the boots on the ground experience in production ag to go out and make the connection between a hillbilly like myself and what they hope to achieve on a wildlife management level. The rigidity of these programs continues to increase as the disconnect between program policy and producers is widened. There's more emphasis placed on the process rather than on the outcomes. There are many ways to reach a destination, and there are no straight lines in nature. If I cover up the timer, I can ignore it. I would encourage a lot more producer level input. Focus groups, things like this. We don't necessarily need to drag gentlemen such as yourselves into it, but you guys need to hear from those of us on the ground who are trying to implement these projects. One of the other things I keep hearing is cover crops, things like that. If a producer has tried that on their own and reported that to NRCS as acreage planted to a cover crop, they're no longer eligible for cost share because that's a pre-existing practice. So if they want to expand that practice on their property, neighbor Joe who's still dragging a moldboard, he can get the funding, but the person that's progressive cannot, and that carries through in a lot of programs. I guess I would ask, as a group, NRCS, USDA, to establish a spirit of cooperation rather than a spirit of strict administration moving forward. So that's my testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Jansen. Thank you very much for being here. Senator Simpson, please finish out the panel, and then we'll have some questions.
I'm going to go ahead and cover up the timer right away. So. Thank you, Chairman Bennet and Ranking.
You guys have all been so good and so that we're in good shape. So take the time you need and don't feel a lot of pressure.
Thank you again, Chairman Bennet and Ranking Member Marshall. So, like some of the other members, I want to offer a little bit of a personal perspective. So I'm here as the Rio Grande Water Conservation District General Manager, and we run a CREP program. But you touched on it in the bio. I'm the fourth generation of my family to farm and ranch in the San Luis Valley. I feel very blessed for the opportunity on a daily basis. I get to farm and ranch with my dad, who's 81, and my 33-year-old son, and I got a little 3-year-old grandson as well. So it's important to me that we manage this new paradigm shift appropriately to give my son and my grandson an opportunity to be the fifth and sixth generations of my family to do this. So I operate a farm in the driest part of Colorado. We get less than 7 inches of precipitation a year. So all of that, my community is the San Luis Valley. All of the culture, economy, and the communities are driven around irrigated agriculture. And the supply of water is just diminishing over really the last 20 years. My farm, I utilize surface water diversions out of the Rio Grande and groundwater from a confined aquifer system, very similar to what my dad and my grandpa did. Uniquely, my surface water priority is an 1879 priority. You would think, man, that's pretty good, that's senior. Not in my basin, that's like a junior water right. I looked this morning, and that water right is now, this morning, the calling priority, which means it's not getting its full diversion. If the river drops another 100 cubic feet per second, that water supply is off. I have acres on my farm that solely depend on surface water. So it's done with its irrigation. So the rest of the year, I'm just subject to whatever natural precipitation we can get. My wells were drilled in the 1960s, and historically they've been a steady supply of water, but it also is challenging in that a whole history of the doctrine of prior appropriation and us pumping water in the valley truly out of priority, and there were ways to mitigate that over time, but it really has culminated, and I'll touch about that in a minute. But the San Luis Valley is about 8,000 square miles and about 500,000 irrigated acres, and it's recognized as highly overappropriated. The surface water was overappropriated by 1900. The groundwater were really overappropriated by 1970 and early 1980s, and the Colorado Supreme Court has affirmed that. There is no unappropriated water left in the San Luis Valley. A highlight, 2002 was really an inflection point for us. It's the driest year in recorded history on the Rio Grande River. So we have the second oldest continuous gauged point in the state of Colorado on the Rio Grande at Del Norte. Historically, that flow averages between 700 and 800,000 acre feet of water a year. In 2002, it was 135,000 acre feet of water. And really, from that point forward, we're now 22 years post 2002, and 2018 was the fourth worst drought in our recorded history. And we just continue to be well below average in snowpack and runoff over that 22-year period. What that really led us to was instrumental in the Colorado General Assembly in 2004 was Senate Bill 222. This was a bill that directed the state engineer to craft rules and regulations about groundwater use in Division 3, the Rio Grande Basin, that required producers to do really two things: remedy or mitigate the injury that your groundwater withdrawals have on surface water rights. And then uniquely, we are tasked with creating and maintaining sustainable aquifers in the Rio Grande Basin. Nobody else in Colorado was doing that. Really, nobody in the western U.S. was doing that in 2002. That really led us to a process to establish sub-districts of the Rio Grande Water Conservation District, tasked again with creating and maintaining sustainable aquifers. The first sub-district to be formed was about 170,000 groundwater irrigated acres that came together to assess themselves fees to run programs to create and maintain a sustainable aquifer system. The centerpiece of that plan was CREP, the CREP program. And I always kind of characterize it feels like to me that program was really kind of written for the breadbasket of the United States, and we were trying to figure out how to utilize it, not for soil conservation efforts exclusively, but more about managing water and groundwater. So it's been this odd kind of fit to try to take CREP and make it applicable to our groundwater situation. When we started our efforts, the sub-district came together and started managing for aquifer conditions in 2012 with the intention of, again, that centerpiece of CREP, identifying we could take 40,000 acres out of production voluntarily and compensated. And really, at that time period, if the next 20 years in 2012 would have looked like the prior 20 years prior to 2002, we take 40,000 acres out, we can recover our aquifer to a standard that we set. So we're 22 years into our program. I'm sorry, we're 12 years into our sub-district program. We haven't been able to get 40,000 acres out of production. We're really under the CREP program about 20,000. And I'll highlight some of the circumstances behind that. Commodity prices played a big role in farmers don't get into this not to farm. And when high commodity prices occur, the CREP program just wasn't competitive. It had regulatory challenges. Look, just dealing with the federal government is hard. I've had producers come to me and say, I want to sign up for CREP. And I'll say, all right, first process is you got to go down to Farm Services Agency, because we're partnered with the USDA and FSA and the Colorado Division of Water Resources to create this CREP program. And if I tell them they got to go to FSA, their immediate response is, I'm not doing it. I don't want to do it. Some of the other challenges, some of the other folks have talked about as well, but having the flexibility and the uniqueness to adapt to our circumstances, whether it's the seed type we use, how much water we can put on it. Payment limitations were challenging. Uniquely, alfalfa as well. We're trying to do this for water conservation efforts. Alfalfa is the most water consumptive use crop we have. That's what I raise as well. And the CREP program requires some sort of, you have to have rotated out of your crop within a certain window, a period of time. Sometimes my alfalfa crops will go 10 years and they don't qualify for the CREP program. I'll kind of finish up and wrap up since I'm 2.5 minutes over already.
I don't dare gavel you down.
It's so important, and farmers are resilient, they're innovative, and partnering with the federal government and the state government in trying to figure this. This isn't drought anymore. This truly is the aridification of the West, and I feel it on a daily basis on my farm. But some efficiencies, so we can gain some ground in efficiencies. Different crop types. I've heard others talk about it. I like Robert Cicada was pointing out, I'm fortunate enough I can assume an incrementally little bit more risk in my farming operations because I have 2 other jobs. And so growing a different crop, I've tried raising hemp for fiber. I'm raising some barley under regenerative practices. I did not go buy a no-till drill, but that's in the cards. The other kind of key thing for us is the introduction of a conversation about groundwater conservation easements. And those have really come to fruition in my basin and afford an opportunity for further discussion.
Let me, I'm going to call, thank you for that, Cleveland. I will solve this problem by asking you my first question, which is, could you talk a little bit about what the producers in the Valley are beginning to think about the use of groundwater conservation easements and how that could be a powerful tool for water conservation if we're able to figure out how to write some Farm Bill language that could support that?
Thank you, Chairman Bennet. Great question. And this is a conversation really unfolded in the Rio Grande Water Conservation District. In 2019, I approached the conservation community and said, look, you have a great template and a model for conserving and protecting surface values. Help me think about a model that, what would a healthier aquifer system mean, to both the surface values that you're enduring to protect and the viability of agriculture here. And it really set us on a path. And I know you have folks from Colorado Open Lands on a panel coming up that really put us in a spot to really dig in, and for first of its kind 2 years ago, had a producer enroll his 12 center pivot systems, his farm, into a traditional conservation easement that included a groundwater conservation component where there's a recognition of the value of him leaving the water into the aquifer and not pumping it out. It was a great collaborative effort to get this ball kind of rolling. There's tremendous effort in the San Luis Valley, particularly if we can nuance it a little bit to go, maybe it's not a complete suspension of your groundwater withdrawals, but maybe a portion of it.
In my mind, this is a perfect example of what we're trying to get to in this conversations that we're having, which is how do we make these programs work better for the reality of the Western United States, not how they look on paper necessarily back in DC. And we're going to need that kind of flexibility. We're going to need that kind of innovation, which brings me to my second question, and I'm going to have a third one for you, Kate, after this. What do we do to get this dryland CREP moving? Now, I'm moving away from Cleve's situation in the San Luis Valley to the situation, we're facing more locally here in the Republican River. What do we, by the way, we noted, yesterday we identified the fact that Republican is pronounced the same way in Kansas as it is in Colorado, unlike the word Arkansas, which is different in Kansas. But what can we do to help move this forward, do you think? Don, let's start with you, and Mr. Lewis, happy to hear you too. And this three states that we've got here.
Yes, we've got this 3-state situation.
Lean into that microphone.
Yeah, I've got I don't have the answer. I wished I did. The bureaucracy is an interesting thing. When I tried to wade through it 8, 9 years ago to open Colorado's CREP up in order to be able to use the irrigation well for domestic well, go from 100 acre feet a year to 1 acre foot a year. DC pushed back big time because they thought on a bunch of these irrigated circles we were going to use the water for apartment buildings. Apartment buildings in the middle of out here, right? So that's the type of pushback we get with the bureaucracy. I think that where you're headed is very helpful with your Improvement Act bill. I think that will help a great deal. One concern I have is the bureaucracy, I think to a certain degree, does not want this to happen. I think it's simple. And without Secretary Vilsack's help, we wouldn't even have it today. And so I think that we'll just have to continue to apply pressure. I don't understand what the reluctance is to conserve the Ogallala Aquifer. I don't understand what the reluctance is to keep young people on the farm by having ground to farm. Let's talk about bureaucracy very quickly here. I want to show you a file from 1972 where my grandfather got an NRCS stock tank plus grass seeding. This is it. It's this thick. It's letter size, right? This is today's program. Inch thick, and we haven't got the project completed yet, so I'm anxious to see if I'll need another one.
Mr. Lewis, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I appreciate it.
I'll enter the thickness of the folders
please
into the
do.
record
I mean,
without
I
objection.
don't need a micrometer to measure this one. It's pretty small.
No, I thank you, and I agree with Don on this. The level of documentation, bureaucracy has certainly increased across all levels of government, and across all agencies within USDA. To answer your question, I think there's two things. One is clarifying what the purpose of the CREP and CRP is really about. I think, as Don has correctly pointed out, I think there's a resistance to it because there's kind of a history of CRP when it went in 1985. That's what it's really about. Well, times change, and the resources we're trying to address change, and we need to be able to clarify to the leadership in FSA and USDA what that's about. There's other resources besides just making sure that we're keeping that soil in the same place it was. The other thing is, I think, where's the decision-making point at? We have, and this again is not only a USDA issue, it's a federal agency issue. We have really good relationships with our state partners or our state conservationists, state FSA directors that really understand the situation on the ground. We're trying to achieve what our producers are facing. And they are often having to argue within their own agency at a higher level to try and get something done. I think we can move that decision-making point down a level or two to the people that are interacting with us on a daily basis. We get better results.
Thank you. I have to gavel myself down because I'm over time, so I'm going to actually go to my colleague for the next couple of questions. I'll come back to you, Commissioner.
Well, Senator Bennet, as I heard the interaction between Mr. Brown and Mr. Lewis, I was reminded that whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting. But what's so impressive, I think, since becoming a member of the Senate and diving deep into these water issues is seeing the level of collaboration that I don't think's always been there. And whether it's our state offices working together or the USDA, and I think the CREP Act that two Democrat senators from Colorado and two Republican senators from Kansas have tried to sit down, as Mr. Jensen suggested, with the producers and figure out how do we take something and make it better. And that's exactly how legislation is supposed to work, and we sure hope hope that makes it into the final farm bill. It's not perfect. Maybe we got time to make it better, but I'm certainly proud of the work that we've done. I want to ask Mr. Lewis a little bit about the Rattlesnake Creek Basin, and just for the edification of folks back in D.C., that Stafford County is also home to Quivira Wildlife Refuge, a wetland of international importance for many, many reasons, something that I've enjoyed for decades now. And on the other hand, 80, maybe 90% of the economy in Stafford County is dependent upon irrigated corn and raising a little bit of cattle. So this is one of the best examples of something you and I have worked on, and Mr. Jensen as well. What, in your opinion, could USDA do to help our producers in the Rattlesnake Creek Basin to solve this riddle?
Thank you, Senator Marshall, and I appreciate that. It's certainly a tough issue for all of us to deal with. Certainly NRCS is already working with the local groundwater management district under a watershed plan to try and to bring some resources to bear, much like was talked about with CREP. The environmental evaluation of that has been very significant and I think very costly. I think we can try and speed that up a little bit. That would be helpful. Certainly the process, assuming that moves forward, they're going to find something that's implementable. We need to be able to move that through the process very quickly so we can get those resources to the producers and on the ground quickly. The dryland CREP option is also overlaps with this area. And certainly, directed funding that maybe there's not a program that fits exactly, but we certainly have a very, as you point out, a very unique resource that we try to find some balance between our agricultural producers and the natural resource and the wildlife refuge. And so a lot of times there's not necessarily a program that fits very well, and I think we need some flexibility for some of our programs to make sure that we can come up with creative solutions.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. And I'll go with Mr. Jensen now, and kind of a follow-up to the same issue. Some producers are early adopters of technology, and some not so much. And I guess I've always tried to figure out, well, why? It's because we're going to have to adapt some new technology in this Stafford County and this Rattlesnake Creek Basin to make this thing work, right? How much of it is the cost, and how much of it is just the bureaucracy of trying to check the boxes to implement this technology? Why don't farmers, ranchers adapt some of these technologies?
A lot of the struggles we've had with the technologies, I've been involved in a couple of different grant and water technology programs over the years. Several years ago, we had, probably 10 or 15 years ago, we had John Deere, Fontenelle, everybody had moisture probes. And, if you bought seed, if you bought a green tractor, you got a moisture probe. And they came out, they put them in, and at the end of the year, they came and took them out. Nobody did any producer education, nobody did any follow-up with them, so they some of the technology, due to lack of follow-through on the part of the people providing it, left a bitter taste in the mouth of some people. Through the last grant I was involved with the Nature Conservancy in K-State, we had 30 cooperators, we had 36 separate fields, and one of the things we found out was that boots on the ground, meeting with those producers, spending time going through the probe data, going through their irrigation scheduling, those type of things, is critical to the success of any of these programs. What we discovered through that thing based on producer engagement is we think that a culture of efficiency in irrigation is somewhere in the neighborhood of 40% mechanical. We can hang stuff on a pivot until it glows in the dark, and it isn't going to make any difference until we make that breakthrough with that producer that they start to engage and get interested in what we're trying to do with them. And that's the challenge, is you're fighting 50 years of it worked for granddad, it worked for dad, why would I want to do anything different? And we're in a new world. We need to figure out how to do the same or better with less.
Thanks. A quick question for Mr. Lewis, maybe you should refer me to somebody else, but I sat down with a producer in the eastern third of the state earlier this week. One of those young families that we're trying to keep in the farming business, right? And he has some EQIP funds to build a terrace. But he's been waiting over a year to get a cultural assessment done. He would gladly pay for the cultural assessment. He wants the cultural assessment, but we've got maybe one person that can do that. What could USDA do or we do to empower the process and not let some of these assessments hold up the process?
Well, I'm certainly not familiar exactly with that situation, but I know we've run into that situation in other places. And I think one thing that NRCS and others could do, there are certainly other folks that can do that work outside of state or federal agency. And as you say, if he's willing to pay for that, I think having a list of folks that they are comfortable, that those folks know what they're doing, they would accept those results, then they can refer that to somebody locally to do that work.
Mr. Brown, go ahead, please.
We're quite familiar with that in Colorado. NRCS in Colorado has the capability of fulfilling the cultural resources component of the evaluation. So if you're putting in a pipeline, NRCS will come and evaluate that for you and with you, and then that box is checked. Farm Service Agency does not have the trained personnel or technicians that have that certificate. So you have to go outside of and hire your own individual to do that for you. It's a 3-hour drive, it's difficult, it's quite expensive. I would think and I would recommend that FSA contract with NRCS to have the NRCS individual conduct that, typically it's the same project anyway, conduct that portion of it.
Thank you. What a reasonable, common sense solution.
Just saying, right?
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. I did have one more question for the Commissioner. You mentioned RCPP in your testimony, which I do think has enormous potential, but has fallen short of that potential in the rollout, and seems to me to be a place where we simply haven't been able to achieve what the legislative intent was. So I wonder whether you could take a minute to talk a little bit, or as long as time as you want, to talk a little bit about the changes you'd want in RCPP. What is it about the partnership of climate smart commodities you mentioned earlier that seems to be working better, and how do we make the whole thing better for producers?
Absolutely, thank you. So I think you've heard up here actually a lot of the conditions that we'd like to see change in RCPP when it comes to administrative burden. We've talked a lot about that. We see that as a significant barrier in RCPP projects. The intent behind RCPP, I agree, is admirable and I think very applicable, especially the focus on regional scale, focus on partnerships, but that administrative barrier is immense for a lot of organizations to participate. Also the lack of administrative costs included in the program, the overhead, the commitment, the 5-year matching commitment, so looking at relaxing some of the matching requirements is certainly something we've heard would be very beneficial. Something we've seen across the board, of course, are project delays. This is out of our hands in some regards, but I think it's key that our federal programs stay focused on keeping to timelines. Even if we're pushed back 18 months, 2 years, we see an incredible increase in costs that can make those projects very difficult to implement given that time. We've also talked a lot about technical assistance. That's another key piece for RCPP. Something we have seen with climate smart commodities. We have seen a lot of these changes in climate smart that have really eased the path to participating and to getting a lot of diverse and really important partners included in those projects. So making sure we're investing in technical assistance both through USDA and local and regional partners is key. You know, all of this I think about is our role to help absorb risk. So much of what we've heard today from producers across the state is the limited margins we have in ag, the hardly any margins, so it's our role to really help absorb that as we look to change. Our CPP can really do better by following what Climate Smart Commodities has done.
Good, great. Well, what a fantastic panel. It's actually hard to believe that you weren't preparing your testimony together. We deeply, deeply appreciate it. Thanks for being in Burlington today. We're going to now transition to the last panel, and we're going to try to move as quickly as possible, but please be patient. Thank you very much. Thank you. We're going to get started for the third panel and try to end as on time as we can. Thank you all. Thank you all for being here today. I begin by introducing Mr. Curtis Sales, a fourth-generation farmer and owner and manager of CFS Farms in Seabird, Colorado. He and his wife Carrie bought their first farm in 1985 and currently own 5,000 acres of dryland farm ground on the eastern plains of Colorado. Curtis employs regenerative agriculture where they emphasize soil health practice while producing a variety of specialty and commodity grains. His farm also incorporates cattle to further improve their land and provide natural fertilizer for growing crops. Thank you for being here today, and we look forward to your testimony. Mr. Carlisle Currier is the president of Colorado Farm Bureau and a fourth-generation rancher in Molina, Colorado, where he raises beef cattle, alfalfa, grass, hay, and small grains. Following his father's example, he quickly became involved in farm organizations to support the local agricultural industry, including the local Colorado Cattlemen's Association and Farm Bureau. Carlisle has extensive experience in water policy, representing the Colorado River Basin Roundtable on the Colorado Interbasin Compact Committee since 2006, and in that role was very involved in writing the agricultural portions of the Colorado Water Plan. I'm grateful for the number of times he's come to visit in Washington in his official capacity. I'm grateful that he's here today. Carlisle, I look forward to your testimony as well. Ms. Sarah Palmer is the Director of Conservation at Colorado Open Lands, where she has led private land conservation work for over a decade. In this role, she's moved the organization to think and work strategically to align land conservation with water challenges. Sarah has also led the development of a technical guide for Colorado's land trust community on collaborative water sharing agreements and led a feasibility study on using conservation easements to enable voluntary compensated reduction of groundwater. Her passion for Western land protection stems from her background growing up as the fifth generation on a cattle ranch in southeastern Arizona. Sarah is the immediate past chair of the Colorado Conservation Easement Oversight Commission. Thank you for being here today, Sarah. We really appreciate it. I look forward to your testimony, and Senator Marshall will introduce the other two witnesses.
We'll have the honor to welcome and introduce two more witnesses from Kansas. And first is one of the living legends of the cattle business, a true pioneer in cattle, one of my mentors that has taught me so much about understanding the modern cattle business, Mr. Jeff Sternberger. Jeff grew up on a cattle and farming operation near Hartner, Kansas, which is on the Oklahoma-Kansas border on the Kansas side. Somehow we lost him to Oklahoma State University, where he got a degree in ag economics, but that's not held him back. He's still been successful. He's went on to work for another great innovation team, the Farm Credit System, now over 100 years old, another great partner for agriculture. And he was making production loans to Oklahoma farmers and ranchers. But today, Mr. Sternberger is the general manager and co-owner of Midwest Feeders at Ingalls, Kansas. Jeff and his lovely wife Colleen are also farming and ranching operations in Kansas and Oklahoma. Jeff has served as the president of the Kansas Livestock Association in 2014 when I met him, and he is a past member of the National Cattlemen's Beef Association Executive Committee and currently serves on the U.S. Premium Board of Directors. And the next young lady I had the opportunity to introduce, she's a budding superstar in agriculture. Amy France is the vice chair of the National Sorghum Producers, otherwise known as the Milo folks, from Scott City, Kansas. She is the first woman to hold a leadership office position on National Sorghum Producers Board of Directors in the organization's 68-year history. She has served the industry on the NSCSP Board of Directors since 2018. She and her husband Clint are third-generation farmers, working alongside their oldest son and their family farm in semi-arid western conditions, mostly on the arid side, I think. They grow grain, sorghum, corn, wheat, and raise Angus cattle. Amy, welcome to you as well.
Thank you all for being here, and Mr. Sales, please kick us off.
Chairman Bennet, Ranking Member Marshall, I was glad that Senator Bennet said we had plenty of time. I wrote down all my thoughts, did a read through, and it was only 16 minutes. And I thought, maybe I better whittle it down.
That's short for the Senate.
Anyway, I hope I do better. Thank you for letting me speak to you today on the tools and processes we've been incorporating over the years to combat the erratic weather patterns that seem to be becoming the norm. Our farm is entirely dry land. This means we do not irrigate any of our crops, so we're completely at the mercy of nature for our moisture. As stated before, I'm a fourth-generation farmer from Seabrook, Colorado, just about 30 minutes west of here, where we are today. I returned to the family farm in 1980. I married my beautiful wife in 1982. She's with me today. Thought I'd better mention that. We have 3 lovely daughters, 2 great son-in-laws, and 6 charming grandchildren. We purchased our first farm in 1985, practicing conservation tillage, meaning leaving as much residue on the surface as possible. 1997, we decided to pursue a no-till farming system. Sold all of our tillage equipment, bought a sprayer, no-till drill, and started continuous crop zero-till. At that time, soil tests indicated that our soil organic matter was less than 1%. In 2014, we were introduced to this new regenerative agriculture at the No-Till on the Plains Conference. By this time, our soil organic matter had increased to 2% over the years of zero-till. In addition, our fertilizer recommendations continued to decrease as nutrient cycling matured. As we looked at the advantages of a healthy soil over chemical and fertilizer, we decided to adopt the suggested regenerative principles. We were already keeping the soil covered and had minimum soil disturbance. We added cover crops and began integrating livestock into our cropping rotation. We now routinely score soil organic matter in the upper 2%, with some fields exceeding 3%. Utilization of the Haney and PLFA soil tests indicate that our soil biological populations are increasing, with a corresponding nutrient credit being created. We've utilized some government programs along the way. We were enrolled in the Conservation Stewardship Program in 2015. Unfortunately, this program was not patterned for large-scale utilization and did not fit our scale. In 2016, we were introduced to Dr. Megan Skapansky, a researcher from Colorado State University. Her team wanted to study the holistic system that we were building from a system-based approach instead of the traditional research model. This research was invaluable. Following this project, we were enrolled in the Farmers Advancing Regenerative Management Systems Program, FARMS for short. This was funded by a USDA NRCS grant. This program supported producers who were building comprehensive soil health management systems on their farms. Last year, we were asked to participate in another program. It's a Western SARE grant-funded project called Farms Beyond Yield, helping indigenous and black farmers understand and utilize regenerative techniques. Lastly, we've been recently enrolled in an NRCS transitional organic program. What we've learned from all of this is simply that the soil must have a carbon reserve if we hope to build resilience in our cropping system. Earlier this spring, Dr. Jerry Hatfield, Agricultural Research Service Senior Researcher, addressed the 2024 High Plains No-Till Conference and shared that most, if not all, farmers in our region are now farming the B horizon. To quickly explain, the soil is divided into layers known as horizons. The A horizon is more commonly known as topsoil, while the B horizon is a more basic substrate, and so on. The topsoil is the rich, high-carbon layer of soil built up over eons of natural processes long before man started tilling the soil. The topsoil layer functions as a whole ecosystem, the foundation of which is soil carbon. Tillage exposes this soil carbon to the atmosphere and triggers its loss as carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. In the high plains, the intact shortgrass prairie had no more than 5% organic matter. In the 100 years since the prairie was broke, tillage agriculture has reduced the levels of soil organic matter to less than 1%. For many years, conventional tillage was the normal cropping system. It still is for farmers today. However, tilling the ground is a consumptive system, meaning the system is always being used up without the ability to rebuild the resource. Dr. Hatfield's comments really hit a note with me and likely resonates with other farmers who grow crops in the former Dust Bowl region. Conventional cropping systems work, as indicated by successful producers in agriculture, but at what long-term cost? If we keep treating the soil like a growing medium without the thought of regenerating it, we'll be locked into a spiral of increasing fertilizer and chemical usage. Without carbon in the soil, we're never going to have the resilience to moderate a changing climate. This has to be a philosophical change. I would like my legacy to be a farm where I watch my grandchildren grow up healthy. I'd like them to not worry about them around the farm getting into something. And I'd really like to pass on a farm that's not yoked to chemicals and fertilizer for profitability. Some areas that need to be addressed as we move forward regeneratively. As we've heard several times today, federal crop insurance must be modified to give incentive to farmers to adopt regenerative systems. Increase the number of crops it covered. Non-traditional crops are discouraged, and if the farmer is forced to use the totally inadequate NAP insurance system, revisit the regulations concerning the usage of cover crop. Maybe performance-based premium discounts for farmers incorporating regenerative practices. And in general, the diminishing APH issue will become a problem if the climate continues to deteriorate and crop insurance is used more often. Additional research is necessary. The research model needs to be a holistic, long-term, system-based research. On-farm, in the real world, is the most realistic. A regenerative produce standard, much like organic, needs to be adopted. We are currently working with an organization called the Soil Carbon Initiative as they work toward this goal. In conclusion, regenerative agriculture is a farmer-driven movement. That is why I think it will succeed. If society wants agriculture to go this way, government has a responsibility to assist. If our environment continues to track toward the erratic, farmers are going to have to adjust to protect the soil to continue to produce. That is the resilience we must foster. Drought resilience, economic resilience, and agronomic resilience must all be pursued. Thank you for letting me testify about a movement that I'm passionate about. I've thrown a lot on the table. Maybe I haven't provided solutions, but I hope I've suggested places to start looking. I look forward to watching the results of this hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Sales. Mr. Courier, you're next.
Thank you, Chairman Bennet, Ranking Member Marshall. My name is Carlisle Courier. I serve as president of the Colorado Farm Bureau, our state's largest general farming organization, representing all four corners of the state and all commodities. I also serve on the board of directors of the American Farm Bureau Federation. I want to thank you for the invitation to participate in today's proceedings as we discuss the compounding challenges and opportunities ushered in by a drier future and more arid future. I'm the fourth generation on my family ranch located in Mountain Valley near Molina, Colorado. My son Joel will be the fifth generation to raise beef cattle, grow hay, and small grains from our home in Mesa County. In my volunteer capacities, I've been fortunate to work with many groups intent on finding adaptations to hotter, drier times. The need for innovation becomes increasingly urgent with each drought cycle. Here in Colorado, our farmers and ranchers have adapted because dwindling water supplies have demanded it. Where I'm from, our high elevation pastures are often flood irrigated. Our producers have improved efficiencies in flood irrigation over the years, and in doing so, we provide a couple of important low-cost trade-offs for the irrigation water we use. For example, we slow water down and provide water for downstream ecological benefits, like water for wildlife and shallow mountain aquifer recharge. We also benefit downstream users. This trade-off provides consistency whether we're talking about our role in delivery through Colorado River Compact compliance or sustainability of our ecosystems. We produce the most nutrient-dense, consumable, and affordable protein in the world. Our ability to use water to grow forage that we feed to livestock results in dividends that shore up our food security issues domestically. The insurance trade-off need to not be dismissed. Additionally, farmers and ranchers in the West play a critical role on federal lands by improving range conditions, preventing wildfires, and maintaining healthy watersheds through grazing. Ranchers with federal grazing permits utilize land that is often ill-suited for other kinds of production. Because we're here to talk about water, I'd like to offer that specifically, grazing on federal lands increases water yields, improves soil structure, and assists with water storage and filtration. A strong partnership between federal agencies and local grazing committees is key to maintaining these ecosystem services. I've been fortunate enough to have a good working relationship with personnel in Grand Mesa National Forest, where I run my cattle in the summertime. Again, they recognize the important trade-offs and contributions of multiple use on federal lands as opposed to an exclusionary preservation system. There are many other ways agriculture is part of the solution for a future we are facing, but our continued contributions depend on the continuing respect for our state's administration of water rights and the private property protections that the prior appropriation system provides. Often this system creates tensions between growing urban centers that need water resources and an agricultural industry that may be hurting during difficult times. Buy and dry programs as a stopgap for conserving water during periods of peak urban and municipal expansion have severe consequences. Buy and dry imperatives do not bode well for our state's economy that depends on agriculture's $9.2 billion of sales contributions. We at Colorado Farm Bureau think buy and dry programs are to be cautioned against because of the consequences to our rural communities and economies. USDA certainly recognizing the importance of rural investment when it comes to helping farmers in rural areas experiencing distress from drought, but there's surely more we can do. We need solutions that fuel long-term economic development and provide multiple benefits, like Senator Bennett's Healthy Watersheds and Healthy Communities Act. I recently heard our Colorado Congressional Congresswoman Caravello say, when speaking about our nation's transition to renewable energy sources, that it must make sense for farmers and ranchers' economic bottom line to be successful. I believe that's equally true when we talk about management of our water resources. There must be a balance between resources and stewardship and economic viability. If farmers and ranchers are expected to take the risk of modifying with new precision and conservation technologies, there must be incentives. The Healthy Watersheds and Healthy Communities Act provides the kind of common sense incentives that leveraging federal investment against private and public partnerships provides. As a founding member of the Colorado Agricultural Water Alliance and past chairman, I know intimately what the needs of water are diverse, and we must avoid a one-size-fits-all approach to our water resources and water roads. By simply reducing cumbersome paperwork requirements and streamlining ideas, CAWA secured funding from the Colorado Water Conservation Board and supported a diverse group of water projects, all with the targeted objective of drought resiliency. They gathered data from respective projects and are now leading the way in solutions that we know will help us through this hotter and drier future. They are varied in method, but the projects in shapes and sizes and duration, they are all part of the equation. We must have more permanent funding for current and ad hoc disasters, and my written comments will tend to talk a little more about those, so I'll move on and just thank you for your time today and opportunity to contribute to this discussion. I hope that you will consider myself and the Colorado Farm Bureau as a resource when it comes to the ideas to help protect and support our nation's resources and rural communities.
Thank you, Mr. Courier. We'll keep your complete record or complete statement in the record. Thank you for that very much. Mr. Sternberger.
Chairman Bennet and Ranking Member Marshall, thank you for allowing me the opportunity to testify today. My name is Jeff Sternberger, and as Senator Marshall mentioned, I'm the general manager and co-owner of Midwest Feeders Incorporated, located in southwest Kansas near Ingalls. I am a past president of the Kansas Livestock Association, a member of the KLA Water Committee, a member of the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, and I also serve on the board of directors of U.S. Premium Beef, a producer-owned, vertically integrated beef system. My wife Colleen and I also own farming and ranching operations in Kansas and Oklahoma. I do have a Bachelor's of Science degree in agricultural economics from Oklahoma State University, and I'm proud of it. Midwest Feeders is a 90,000 head custom cattle feeding operation. The majority of the cattle owned in our feed yard are owned by other cattle producers. Our team provides feed and animal care during the finishing phase. While we raise some of the forage and grain needed to feed the cattle in our care, the vast majority is purchased from farmers in the region. My testimony today will focus on our efforts to conserve water. The primary water source in southwest Kansas is groundwater from the Ogallala Aquifer. Depletion of the aquifer has received considerable attention in the last few years. As stakeholders have developed a better understanding of the rate of depletion, discussions around water use reduction and conservation have accelerated. While efforts have accelerated recently, our operation has been implementing practices to use water more efficiently for many years. These efforts go back 30+ years as irrigation water rights were converted to stock water rights. These water rights were exercised using flood irrigation technology. Water was conserved simply by shifting away from the less efficient flood irrigation system. Converting water rights from irrigation to stock water also results in reduced water use. In 2018, we enrolled multiple water rights in a water conservation area, or WCA. The WCA allowed us flexibility on how we utilize our water rights in exchange for reducing our historical water use by 10%. The flexibility allowed us to more efficiently use water from multiple rights in our integrated system that supplies water to the cattle in our feed yard. In 2019, we completed an expansion that added additional capacity to our feed yard. As part of that expansion, we installed a water recycling system that captures overflow from the waters in part of the feed yard. The water savings from the recycling system has averaged between 1 and 2 gallons per head per day. For comparison, our typical water consumption across the feed yard averages 9 to 10 gallons per head per day. We completed another facility expansion in 2022. That included another recycling system. We have seen similar water savings in that system as well. The investments we have made allowed us to use water more efficiently. That's essential to the long-term viability of our operation. Our viability also is dependent on the forage and grains produced by farmers in our area. Last year, we began meeting with neighboring farmers to discuss the potential of extending water conservation efforts to farms in the area. We believe there is potential to use a WCA or LEMA to realize water conservation while still providing the revenue necessary for the farming operation and growing the forage and grain we need in our cattle feeding operation. If we are successful, we know other feed yards will take a similar approach in other areas. We have been fortunate to be able to make significant investments in our operation to achieve water conservation. From a policy standpoint, support from the federal level will accelerate investment across cattle feeding, dairy production, and farming. I suggest you consider cost share programs and tax credits as options that would support investment in technologies that provide water savings. The upcoming Farm Bill discussion would be an opportunity to expand conservation programs to include these types of investments. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sternberger. Thanks for being here. Ms. France, thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Bennet, Ranking Member Marshall, and members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to speak at today's hearing. My name is Amy France, and my family and I farm and raise livestock in western Kansas. We primarily raise grain sorghum, milo, corn, wheat, as well as Angus cattle. I also serve as Vice Chair of National Sorghum Producers, aka Milo. As third and fourth generation farmers in western Kansas, we live with the impact of drought and limited water resources with firsthand experience of the importance of water conservation efforts in agriculture. Today's hearing provides a great opportunity to discuss water conservation and, more importantly, the need for irrigation water savings to protect the Ogallala Aquifer. But first, I want to express my gratitude to Senators Bennet and Marshall for your bipartisan leadership and commitment to agriculture at the federal, state, and local levels. The High Plains is a harsh climate that includes limited precipitation and extreme temperatures. Precipitation falls short of evaporation rates, leaving areas in the western U.S. in a moisture deficit. And the U.S. Drought Monitor shows that. In Scott County, where I live, it has consistently experienced drought conditions for the past several years. Because sorghum is more efficient in the use of water than other crops, it is a key tool for enhancing the overall sustainability and profitability for my family farm. As the resource-conserving crop, sorghum is a hardy, drought-tolerant, high-residue crop that conserves soil moisture and reduces soil erosion. Despite the harsh and fragile nature of High Plains, the region still produces, on average, 3/4 of the U.S. sorghum crop under these challenging conditions. While USDA NRCS policy does recognize sorghum's contribution in a crop rotation, it should provide more compensation and greater incentives for resource-conserving crops such as sorghum. I want to speak today about the importance of work being done at the local level organizations like the Southwest Kansas Groundwater Management District Number 3. GMD3 has actively engaged with farmers in Kansas and neighboring farmers in Colorado, helping producers benchmark their irrigation efficiency against other area producers, providing technical, educational, and financial assistance to drive improvements in performance. Other GMDs have taken different approaches. For example, farmers under the Northwest Kansas GMD self-imposed irrigation pumping guidelines. In the years following implementation, area farmers increased sorghum planting by over 400%, reduced water utilization by over 25%, and reduced water decline by 78%. In this case, crop choice was a vital tool for preserving groundwater and helping keep farmers farming. My groundwater management district, the West Central Kansas GMD, has implemented similar measures with results that double what expectations were at the beginning of the program. We appreciate the efforts of Senators Bennet, Moran, Lujan, and Heinrich for introducing legislation that allows farmers to convert irrigated acres to dry land by placing their water rights into voluntary conservation easements. This creates water savings that are attributed directly back to the aquifer, helping to reduce overappropriations and to stabilize this important resource. From my perspective, federal, state, and local policies need to incentivize action which effectively deliver actual water savings in the Ogallala Aquifer. It is vital to preserve critical resources for agricultural, industrial, and municipal uses. Mr. Chairman, we can do this by adopting new technologies, improving practices and policies, and harnessing inherent attributes of lower water crop uses like sorghum. With my time remaining, for my testimony today, I would like to emphasize how critical it is that the Senate Ag Committee commit to Farm Bill reauthorization this year. The impact of lower commodity prices and high input costs, coupled with prolonged drought in some areas, make the need for update to the farm safety net more important. National Sorghum Producers has shown and offered its support in the framework released by Ranking Member Bozeman earlier this month. Conversely, our analysis of the Democratic framework shows that sorghum and wheat industries actually lose significantly in the commodity support. We need a farm bill this year, not next year. The farm safety net hangs in the balance, as well as farm families. I want to thank you and the subcommittee for your time today and for your proactive, collaborative approach to these issues that are so critical for agriculture. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. France. Thank you very much for that testimony. Ms. Palmer, you have the last word, no pressure.
Oh,
and
lots
then
of
we'll
pressure.
have some questions.
I'm already terrified of the red button.
No, don't worry about it.
But Chairman Bennet, Ranking Member Marshall, members of the subcommittee, staff, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here to talk about the nexus between your work and mine. My name is Sarah Parmar. I'm Director of Conservation for Colorado Open Lands. We are a statewide nonprofit that's worked for over 40 years to conserve land and wildlife, for land and water for people and wildlife. And since that time, we've conserved over 680,000 acres together with 720 associated water rights across the state of Colorado using conservation easements. We've focused on irrigated agricultural land because we recognize that continued irrigation in rural communities is the cornerstone of the economy, ecology, and heritage that we all value. And we recognize, as Senator Marshall so eloquently said earlier today, that issues of water are overshadowing issues of land and are critical, and that we as a land trust need to innovate our tools that we bring to the table for producers in facing these challenges. We've worked to adjust and adapt our conservation easements to add flexibility for water rights, to combat buy and dry, and we've looked at ways to support aquifer recovery. You heard from our illustrious state Senator Cleve Simpson earlier today about the Herculean challenges and matching efforts, I would say, of his home community in bringing their groundwater supplies into a sustainable level and avoiding a regulatory shutdown, a shutdown that would hurt economy and ecology equally. In 2019, we began working with Mr. Simpson and other really creative water managers in the San Luis Valley to explore whether we could take a traditional conservation easement and adapt it to support aquifer recovery. And we started with listening sessions because we wanted to understand what would work for farmers. And what we heard from folks overwhelmingly was that there were so many people who want to be part of the solution, who want to do the right thing, but they're farming because they love farming and they don't really want to be paid not to farm. They want to be compensated for a reduction. And what came out of these conversations was this idea of a groundwater conservation easement, a tool that is both permanent and enforceable, a tool that qualifies for tax incentives and funding programs, a tool that can be tailored by region and actually by farm, and a tool that doesn't dictate how producers achieve those water savings on their own farm. Colorado Open Lands worked with a farmer to complete the first groundwater conservation easement, as Mr. Simpson shared. And the savings from this groundwater conservation easement will allow all of his neighbors, all of the other irrigators in this groundwater subdistrict to continue in production and will benefit wetlands on the nearby National Wildlife Refuge. Now, we explored funding for groundwater conservation easements through the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, but National Headquarters staff had concerns about alignment of program purpose. And so we were instead encouraged to apply and were awarded a Regional Conservation Partnership Program grant. We have incredible staff working for the Natural Resources Conservation Service here in Colorado under the leadership of State Conservationist Clint Evans. We have significant experience implementing Farm Bill programs successfully, and I will say that we found it exceptionally difficult to utilize our CPP for conservation easements. On the other hand, the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program is a known and trusted tool with staff who have real estate experience. I would advocate that the creation of a groundwater conservation easement program under ACEP, as envisioned by Senator Bennet in the the Voluntary Groundwater Conservation Act that he sponsored last year, would create the necessary program purpose alignment for USDA and provide an impetus for the agency to build expertise in water rights. The creation of even a pilot program in the upcoming Farm Bill reauthorization would enable NRCS and partners to undertake some of the necessary trial and error involved with the implementation of this program. But by both highlighting the need to address water and integrating it into existing Farm Bill programs, you really give us as partners the ability to innovate alongside producers. I would say that agriculture has always been an inherently risky occupation, much more about love of lifestyle than certainty of returns. I am the fifth generation to get to grow up on my family's ranch, and most of my childhood memories were wet, playing in the creek, getting stuck on the road between our house and school, which was 30 miles away. And now I have incredibly difficult conversations with my father about how 2 out of the last 3 years were the driest that he ever experienced in his 50 years on the ranch. The well that serves my childhood home, the home that I hope to return to one day to take over management of the ranch, is currently dry. At 72 years old, my dad is still constantly working to find new ways to align his management of the ranch with what Mother Nature provides. He hasn't given up, and neither can we. Water is messy and it's complicated, but to solve the looming issues that threaten our agricultural industry, we have to be prepared to dive into that messiness and complexity, and we have to bring USDA in with us. I would argue that we need to facilitate reduction with production as we look to support producers and keep communities alive while we recover aquifers. I want to thank Senators Bennet and Marshall for hosting this and for looking beyond bipartisan lines to really get to the heart of these issues, and for asking how the next Farm Bill can support the innovation we need to create the resiliency in our communities. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for bringing us home. You did a great job, Sarah. I'm going to actually start with you, if that's all right.
That is all right.
As you know, we've been talking to USDA and to folks in D.C. about how to get this groundwater conservation program started. One of the things that I hear from USDA sometimes is that they're just saying that the Western water law is just too complicated for them to be able to administer a nationwide program. I realize there are questions about maybe a pilot, not a pilot, but in the broadest sense, could you talk a little bit about that? Because we do want our water law respected. We do not want it changed in any way by what they do. But I'm worried that the attitude of throwing up their hands and saying it's just too complicated is not going to allow the creative people in the valley, for example, to be able to achieve the benefits that you've described.
Well, I really appreciate the question, and I don't blame them for being intimidated. I believe that folks at USDA really want to ensure program integrity, and I appreciate that. I do think that there are ways to create national program criteria around monitoring and enforcement being required for implementing groundwater conservation easements, but being able to delegate the authority to the states, to the state conservationists who do understand the state law and the water regimes that they're operating within, to be able to demonstrate how they can meet that national criteria of monitoring and enforcement, I think are very important. But I think it's very much possible, and I think that there are Farm Bill programs that we've talked about today that already rely on state water law or are subject to state water law. So I don't think we're paving totally new ground, but I think we have to try.
I do think that it's really important for us when we think about the kind of easements that you're talking about, and other conservation easements, that they're not tied up in the bureaucracy in D.C. where people may not know exactly what people on the ground are wrestling with, or the expertise that the state and water districts and others have. So we look forward to continuing to partner with you on that. Carlisle, I just can't resist it because you're here, whether you know it or not, representing the upper basin of the Colorado River. I know you know it. Could you talk a little bit about what you and other producers have already done to cut back on water use in your operations in drought years? I know there aren't a lot of big reservoirs in the mountains above where you farm. Just give the country a little bit of a sense of what it's like from a water perspective to produce at the elevation that you produce and that high up in the Colorado River Basin.
Well, thank you for the question, Senator Bennet. Yeah, that certainly is a major issue as ongoing discussions on the Colorado River Compact, and the protocol for operation of the river has not only allowed but really encouraged, I think, overuse of the river in the lower basin by sending water down to Lake Mead and encouraging people to use that, even though it's creating a situation where the reservoirs are at crisis level. In the upper basin, we don't have that option. In my area, I am 100% dependent on annual snowpack. So we have a year with low snowpack. I don't have the water. It's not there. In 2021, I raised less than a quarter of my normal crop because I was out of irrigation water by this time of the year and couldn't raise any alfalfa after that and had to buy lots of expensive hay to feed my cows. We are doing things to try to help with that situation by using water more efficiently. There's been a lot of proposed projects, some of the drought management projects that have been proposed as far as paying farmers to forego part of their use. I think it's an important tool that should be considered and should be tried. I don't have a lot of hope that there will be a lot of solution there, but if we don't try it, we certainly won't know whether it'll work. Anything we can do to expand the availability of that precious resource of water to use less of it for what we're doing with it and allow more for other uses is certainly going to be a benefit.
Thank you. And the last few seconds that I have, take your time, Mr. Sales, but you ended your testimony in such a hopeful sense of what the future could bring. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit at the end here about what we could do to the USDA conservation programs that you think would be most helpful to folks that were just starting out or wanting to start out in regenerative practices, the kinds of conservation practices that you described.
I think probably the most important thing would be continuing education. So anybody that's involved in a government program, especially if it's focused on regenerative ag, it should be a requirement that we have plenty of great conferences around. I think young guys need to, I think there's education thing. Another thing we learned through the Farms program was a lot of times young guys, of course, grandpa and dad are still on the farm. There's a lot of, that's not how we've done it. We don't want to do anything new, yada, yada. We even had some young guys say that their neighbors treated them different if they're doing these new things. I don't think the government can handle that. I think it would be better that the government incentivize programs like Farms that allow the mentorship, mentee type of a deal.
Thank you. Thank you. Senator Marshall?
All right, thank you. I want to spend my last few moments here talking about the terms climate smart and climate friendly, and in particular how they're defined and being used by the IRA and the USDA. So Ms. France, what would you say to those in DC that say unless the conservation practice you implement on your operation have a greenhouse mitigation or sequestration effect, those practices aren't climate friendly?
Well, I would say farmers are the first to be climate friendly, and I'll stand by that forever. But I would say one size does not fit all for climate friendly. We heard about cover crops earlier, and for Western Kansas, as you mentioned in your opening, that just doesn't fit. But things that we have done is leaving stubble. And so what that does is that keeps the moisture in the soil. It helps with soil erosion. And so although that is not seen as a cover crop, that's certainly what works best for us. So we have to be very careful in defining climate friendly and making sure that term is widely encompassing all areas. So my challenge would be putting a true definition to that to fit all regions.
But would you agree with me that agriculture is only able to use about 40% of that IRA conservation funding? And if it was opened up, that indeed there are some real practical uses agriculture could use that would indeed be climate friendly?
Yes, National Sorghum Producers has publicly supported moving IRA funding into the conservation title. That just gives more runway for those funds to be put into growers' pockets when they need them the most.
And then, Mr. Sternberger, I want to talk to you about climate smart practices. Can you describe how USDA is engaged with the Kansas Livestock Association to learn which livestock production practices should be included in this list of climate smart IRA practices?
Yes, Senator Marshall, thanks for the question. In in a conversation with a KLA staffer, he indicated there was likely one cursory conversation with the USDA in regards to that in this past year. They felt like that they were overly focused on checking the box of the appropriate box as far as climate change or carbon sequestration. And it's my personal belief, and I believe that its KLA policy direction would be that they would be a lot more in favor of conserving our resources that we currently have. For example, in western Kansas, where we get less rainfall than we do in the eastern part of the state, we rely a lot on the Ogallala Aquifer, and there are efforts there we could be doing to conserve that water to raise more crops for the livestock industry, as well as making the farmers a lot more economically viable by doing so. In the eastern part of the state, they're more concerned with water quality and rangeland health and focusing on programs like that. I feel like that if the American farmer and rancher are more focused on producing food more economically, we could possibly get a little better control over the food inflation that we've got in this country.
Thank you. Ms. France, let's talk about the future. You've got 3 kids, is that right?
Well, blessed with 2, marrying into, and then have 3 of my very own.
There we go.
Yes.
So, but as we talk about the future of agriculture, where does conservation meet agriculture 30, 50 years from now? What are your children and grandchildren going to be doing that we're not doing today? What are you excited about?
Well, to speak about my children now, our oldest son is running truck, my oldest daughter is running combine, my 12-year-old is running grain cart, and my daughter is working as a teller and then will take meals at supper. So that's the generation right now, already hard in the field. But they're very aware of what's coming down the pike. We talk about it. Even though we live in rural Kansas, rural America, where agriculture is the heartbeat, there are still many people that surround us that don't understand what it's going to take to keep agriculture moving forward. We talk about the Ogallala Aquifer, and I can echo what Sarah's saying about, wells going dry. And so when wells go dry, farming goes dry, and cities go dry. So that's a conservation that I'm looking at, is actually a personal conservation, keeping rural America alive, and that's keeping agriculture alive and conserving that aquifer and doing all that we can do. It'll look very different, I'm sure of it, but these kids are anxious to keep on the tradition, and I'm excited to see what they do.
So last question, I think, is we made it through a whole hearing and no one has mentioned high-speed internet. How important is that to conservation practices and the future of your farm and your family?
It's everything. We can speak to it. Last year we sat on, I believe it was 2022, sat on the side of the field because we could not connect to start planting. And so we lost valuable time. I actually mentioned to Sarah when we lost Wi-Fi and electricity, I said, welcome to Western Kansas, Eastern Colorado. Yeah. But it is very vital. I don't know anything that works without it. And our kids are very fortunate to have what they do, but we keep saying, we're going to pull GPS out of your tractor and you're going to learn to follow the line so that when things go wrong, you can still farm.
Yeah, but certainly to do the conservation practices today with precision agriculture more than ever, and that all that precision agriculture leads to conserving water as well as using less inputs, less fertilizers, less pesticides, and we can't do that without high-speed internet.
Absolutely.
But thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much to our last panel. It was just as fantastic. Let's give them a round of applause, too. Senator Marshall, would you like to say a word of closing before we wrap up?
Again, Senator Ben, I'm just honored to be here with you and your commitment to leaving this world cleaner, healthier, and safer than we found it. As we went through the discussions, well, what did we miss? And I wish we had time for 1 or 2 more panels. And I think we would probably bring up some more people like Sarah. And I just want to thank my conservation partners in Kansas. The Nature Conservancy does a great job Ducks Unlimited does a great job. Kansas Land Trust, Kansas Wildlife Federation, Kansas Grazing Lands Coalition, all those people that we kind of touched on today that are so important as well. So thank you to all those folks and their practices. We didn't talk about playas, and I was hoping someone would bring those up. Vitally important. I think that we've seen great progress in Kansas. There's opportunities here. I think we need to emphasize the playas and how we can if you set aside 4 acres of a playa, it's going to recuperate an acre-foot every year. And again, we'll be using less inputs. We won't be wasting fertilizer, and it's good for all the birds and all those things as well. I think if I would have a message from today, it's that we have a plan. Sometimes we make it overcomplicated, but we need to take this simple plan and then implement it perfectly. And by perfectly, it's going to be through volunteerism, but somehow bringing the other people aboard. I don't think we've really touched 10 or 20% of the conservation opportunities that are out there that could be implemented even further. So I think that's our goal and our challenge is how do we be better educators? How do we better communicate the opportunities from a conservation standpoint? We can't make it rain anymore, but we can certainly figure out better ways to conserve water. So I'm honored to be here with you today and look forward to getting a farm bill across the finish line. And I think we learned, again, valuable information from today where we set our priorities. So thank you for having me and my staff.
Thank you, Senator Marshall. Colorado, let's give Senator Marshall a round of applause for being here today. Really appreciate your making the trip. And next time we'll flip it. We'll do the hearing over there. We'll spend the evening over here the night before. But this has been really tremendous. And I want to thank all the witnesses that have traveled here, the people that have come from across the states of Colorado and Kansas and the High Plains. We've heard a story, I think, if you listen to the people talking about the history of the region, that this has been a story of innovation from the very beginning. And as Amy was just saying at the end, for her children, things may look very different, years from now, but the important thing is they're going to still be on the land producing the food and fiber that we need. That's not going to happen without farmers and ranchers being able to innovate, but it's also not going to be able to happen without a USDA that can innovate as well in real time and in a way that can match the innovation of the producers that are facing these enormously difficult decisions and scarcity, just like their forebears did. And so I think what I heard a lot today was not so much how new it was all going to be, but it's it's the continuity of the innovation that we've already had. We've got to bring that to bear in an urgent way in the drought conditions that we're facing. And I think part of what our challenge is to make sure that the innovation here can be calibrated by what's going on in Washington, D.C., and that's where all of you come in. That's why your testimony is so important today. I think it's why it's important for you to stay in touch with Roger and stay in touch with me and the other members of the Agriculture Committee, because that's where that syncing up is going to happen. I agree. I think Robert Sakata said this very well at the very beginning. We have to figure out a way when margins are as thin as they are to give people a chance to make mistakes along the way too and to learn from those mistakes. That's a very hard thing for anybody to do. It's a particularly hard thing for a bureaucracy like the one we have in D.C. to do. So I couldn't be more grateful for all of you that made this possible. I want to thank in particular the witnesses for providing their perspectives today. Senator Marshall, for your partnership both in and outside of the gymnasium back there in the Capitol, and to all of our fellow subcommittee members that are not present today. I'd like to tell them to please submit any additional statements or questions for the record to the committee clerk 5 business days from today, or 5:00 p.m. next Wednesday, July 3rd, 2024. I also, on behalf of Senator Marshall, want to thank Chairman Stabenow and Ranking Member Bozeman for their leadership of the committee. I know they have staff here as well, and we're grateful to have the chance to do this field hearing, because I think it really is an opportunity for the committee to hear directly from people here on the eastern plains of Colorado and in western Kansas. And with that, I hope everybody travels safely this afternoon. Thank you very much for coming here, and thank you for all you do to keep our rural economy alive. We have a decision to make in this country about whether or not we're going to keep rural America, whether we're going to keep rural hospitals and rural schools and agriculture that's the backbone of our rural communities. And I know Senator Marshall and I are committed